This appears just before your loneliness turns into self-discovery. Carl Jung. There's a moment that comes to all of us, a moment that psychiatry tried to bury, that modern psychology attempted to medicate away, that self-help culture desperately tried to rebrand as something fixable with 5 easy steps. Carl Jung discovered it in the depths of his own psychological breakdown, in the silence of his isolation from his mentor Freud, in the terrifying months when he thought he was losing his mind. He discovered that there is a specific feeling, a particular quality of consciousness that appears in the deepest loneliness, and it is not what you think. It's not despair, it's not depression, though depression often accompanies it. It's not sadness, though sadness flows through it like a dark river. No, what Jung identified was something far stranger, far more electric, far more alive. He called it the psyche's distress signal before transformation. And here's what makes this discovery so unsettling. Your loneliness isn't a problem to solve. It's an initiation ritual your unconscious has designed specifically for you. Think about that for a moment. Every self-help book tells you loneliness is the enemy. Every therapist is trained to help you overcome it. Every social media platform exists to distract you from it. But what if they're all wrong? What if loneliness isn't a bug in the system of human consciousness? What if it's a feature? What if it's the exact mechanism by which your psyche breaks you down so it can rebuild you into who you actually are? I want you to consider something that might sound impossible. There are 2 types of people who experience profound loneliness. The first type spirals deeper and deeper into isolation, becoming bitter, resentful, increasingly disconnected from reality and meaning. They emerge from loneliness, damaged, hardened, diminished. But the second type, and this is what Jung spent decades studying, the second type emerges from the exact same loneliness awakened. They emerge with clarity they never had, with purpose they couldn't have imagined, with a sense of self so solid that external validation becomes almost irrelevant. Same loneliness, completely opposite outcomes. Why? What makes the difference? What invisible psychological mechanics determine whether your loneliness destroys you or initiates you? That's what this script will reveal. Not theory, not speculation. The actual hidden architecture of loneliness's gateway that Jung mapped through his own descent and through decades of work with patients who made this crossing. But first, let me tell you about a feeling you've probably experienced but never had words for. You're in a crowded room, maybe a party, maybe a work conference, maybe even surrounded by family at a holiday gathering. Everyone is talking, laughing, performing the social ritual of connection, and you are utterly devastatingly alone. Not just alone, invisible. You can see them, but they cannot see you, not the real you. They see the mask you're wearing, the persona you've constructed, the version of yourself you present to survive in social space. But the actual you, the one underneath all that performance, that self is locked in solitary confinement even as you smile and nod and say the right things. If you've ever felt this, pause here. Not everyone has. Some people never experience this particular species of loneliness, but if you have, you know exactly what I'm describing. It's the loneliness of being unseen while being looked at, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who know your name, but not your interior life. The loneliness that comes not from lack of company, but from lack of genuine contact. Jung had a name for this. He said, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself, or from holding certain views which others find inadmissible." Read that again. Loneliness doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being unable to share what's actually real for you. It comes from holding a version of reality that doesn't match the consensus, and knowing that if you speak it, you'll be rejected, pathologized, or worse, ignored. This is the loneliness of the psyche in exile. And here's what Jung discovered that changes everything. This exile isn't random. It's not bad luck. It's not a character flaw or a social skills deficit. This exile is purposeful. Your unconscious has engineered it. Because there's something you need to discover about yourself, something you need to integrate, something you need to become, and you cannot do it while you're still performing the social role that keeps you acceptable to the tribe. The loneliness you're experiencing right now, the isolation that feels like punishment, the disconnection that feels like evidence of your unworthiness. It's actually your soul's way of pulling you out of false relationship so you can enter true relationship, first with yourself, then perhaps with others who can actually see you. But you have to understand, this process will break you first. The initiation always begins with a breaking. What breaks is the false self, the persona, the constructed identity you've been maintaining through sheer force of will and constant vigilance. That structure is going to crack. It's already cracking. That's why you're feeling this particular quality of loneliness. Electric, urgent, almost unbearable. It's the sound of your psyche demanding emergence. And here's the forbidden truth that Jung uncovered. You cannot medicate this away. You cannot positive think your way around it. You cannot bypass it with spirituality or distract yourself from it with compulsive productivity or numb it with substance or soothe it with temporary connection. The only way through is through. The only way to transform loneliness into self-discovery is to stop running from it and start listening to what it's trying to tell you. There's a reason they buried this insight. There's a reason modern culture is terrified of solitude, why we're constantly told that being alone is dangerous, that isolation is pathological, that you need to be constantly connected to others to be healthy. Because if people discovered what Jung discovered, that loneliness is the doorway to the self, that isolation is where you meet who you actually are, that the dark night of disconnection is preparation for the dawn of authentic consciousness, then the whole system of control through conformity would collapse. Think about it. What keeps people obedient? What keeps people performing? What keeps people suppressing their truth and molding themselves into acceptable shapes? The fear of being alone, the terror of exile from the tribe, the anxiety that if you stop pretending, stop performing, stop maintaining the mask, you'll be abandoned, cast out, left to die in the wilderness of your own company. But what if that wilderness is actually where you become real? What if that exile is actually where you find your authority? What if the loneliness you're running from is actually the crucible in which your authentic self is forged? Jung discovered this in his own life. After his break with Freud, he entered what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of such intense psychological upheaval that he was unsure whether he would emerge sane. He was professionally isolated. His colleagues thought he'd gone mad. He had no map, no guide, no mentor to tell him he wasn't losing his mind. He was alone with the chaos of his own psyche, with dreams and visions that terrified him, with inner figures that spoke to him in ways that seemed psychotic. But he didn't run. He didn't medicate. He didn't distract. Instead, he did something radical. He listened. He engaged. He dialogued with the chaos. He let the images speak. He recorded everything in what would later become the Red Book, a document so personal, so revealing, so psychologically dangerous that his heirs kept it locked away for decades after his death. And what emerged from that loneliness, from that isolation, from that confrontation with the unconscious? The entire framework of depth psychology that you're learning about right now, the concepts of the shadow, the anima, the self, individuation, all of it came from Jung's willingness to stay in the loneliness instead of fleeing from it. His breakdown became his breakthrough. His isolation became his initiation. His loneliness transmuted into the most creative and generative period of his entire life. This is what's possible for you. Not theory, not metaphor, actual transformation. But you have to understand what you're being initiated into. You have to recognize that the loneliness you're experiencing isn't random suffering, it's meaningful suffering. It has a purpose, it's taking you somewhere. And if you can learn to read its signals, if you can decode what your unconscious is trying to communicate through this isolation, you can emerge from this darkness, not damaged, but awakened. So here's the question you need to ask yourself right now, before we go any deeper. Are you willing to stop treating your loneliness as a problem and start treating it as an initiation? Are you willing to consider that the pain you're in isn't proof of your brokenness, but evidence of your transformation? Are you willing to stay in the fire long enough to see what it's burning away? Because what's about to be revealed in this script is not comfort, it's not reassurance, it's not a path back to the safety of conformity and social acceptability. What's coming is the actual mechanics of transformation, the hidden psychological architecture of how loneliness becomes self-discovery. And once you see it, once you understand it, you cannot unsee it. You cannot go back to the comfortable unconsciousness you had before. Jung warned about this. He said that the journey of individuation, the journey of becoming who you truly are, requires courage. Not physical courage, but the courage to face yourself, the courage to confront what you've been avoiding, the courage to integrate what you've been rejecting, the courage to become conscious even when consciousness is uncomfortable. Your loneliness is the call. The question is, will you answer? Let me tell you about David. On paper, David had achieved everything our culture tells us will make us happy. At 38, he was a senior executive at a Fortune 500 company. He had the corner office, the impressive title, the salary that made his parents proud and his college friends envious. He wore tailored suits, drove a German sedan, lived in a downtown loft with exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows. He attended networking events, closed deals, gave presentations that boards of directors applauded. And on the night of his promotion party, the night his colleagues toasted his success, the night his boss publicly praised his leadership, the night he should have felt triumphant, David stood in the corner of that crowded room, experiencing the most devastating loneliness of his entire life. Not because no one was talking to him, everyone wanted to talk to him. He was the star of the evening. But as person after person congratulated him, shook his hand, told him they were impressed, he realized something horrifying. Not a single person in that room knew him. They knew the David he performed at work. They knew the David who projected confidence, who made decisive calls, who never showed uncertainty or vulnerability. They knew the mask, but the actual human being underneath that mask, the one who was terrified he was a fraud, who felt hollow inside, who couldn't remember the last time he'd felt genuine joy, that David was completely unknown, invisible, alone in a room full of people celebrating him. This is what Jung called the persona, and understanding the persona is absolutely critical to understanding why you're experiencing the loneliness you're in right now. The persona in Jung's framework is the mask we construct to interface with the social world. It's not fake, it's necessary. Every human being needs a persona to function in society. You cannot show up authentically in every context. You need different presentations for different settings. The persona is how you adapt to social roles. The professional at work, the parent at home, the friend in social settings, the stranger in public. These are all slightly different presentations of self, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. The problem emerges when the persona stops being a tool you use and becomes a prison you inhabit. When you can no longer take the mask off. When the performance becomes so constant, so convincing, so demanded by everyone around you, that you forget there's a real face underneath it. This is what Jung called identification with the persona, when you mistake the mask for your actual identity, and this is exactly what loneliness exposes. Loneliness is the moment when the persona stops working, when the mask cracks, when the performance fails to generate the connection you actually need. Because here's what David discovered that night, what you might be discovering right now. You can be perfectly successful at maintaining your persona and still be completely disconnected from yourself and everyone around you. Jung said, "The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is." This is the key insight. The persona isn't just how you present yourself to others, it's also how you've learned to present yourself to yourself. You've performed the role so long that you've convinced yourself this is who you are. You've received so much validation for the persona that you've abandoned the authentic self underneath it. Think about what you get praised for. Think about what gets you approval, what makes people like you, what earns you respect and recognition. Now ask yourself honestly, is that actually you? Or is that a carefully curated presentation designed to elicit specific responses from others? Are you being yourself, or are you being what works? Most people have been performing for so long they cannot even distinguish between authentic self-expression and strategic self-presentation anymore. The mask has fused to the face. The role has consumed the actor. And then loneliness arrives like a mirror, forcing you to see that everything you've built, your relationships, your reputation, your sense of self, is constructed on a foundation of performance rather than authenticity. This is what Jung called the mask maintenance crisis. It's the exhausting work of constantly monitoring and adjusting your presentation to maintain social approval. You're vigilant about what you say, how you say it, what you reveal, what you conceal. You're always calculating, if I show this part of myself, will they still like me? If I admit this fear, will I lose respect? If I stop being cheerful, will people abandon me? And here's the devastating truth. It works. The mask maintenance works. People do respond to your persona. They do give you validation, affirmation, approval. But that validation is hollow because it's not actually for you. It's for the performance. They're applauding the mask, not the face. And deep in your unconscious, you know this. Your psyche knows you're not being seen. And that knowledge creates a specific species of suffering, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who like something about you that isn't actually real. David's story continued in a way that will sound familiar to many of you. After his promotion party, he went home to his expensive loft, poured himself an expensive whiskey, and sat in the dark, wondering why he felt nothing. No joy, no satisfaction, just a vast emptiness and a question he couldn't shake. Who am I when nobody's watching? He started noticing patterns. At work, he was decisive, confident, always had the answer, but alone he was paralyzed by self-doubt. In meetings, he spoke with authority, but in his apartment he had no idea what he actually believed about anything. With colleagues, he was engaging, charismatic, the person people wanted on their team. But by himself, he felt like a hollow shell, a collection of rehearsed responses with no center. This is the persona crisis, and it manifests as loneliness because the persona can only connect with other personas. Mask meets mask. Performance meets performance. You have relationships, but they're relationships between false selves. And your psyche knows this. Your unconscious understands that no genuine intimacy is possible when you're relating from behind a mask. So it generates the feeling of loneliness, not as punishment but as communication. It's trying to tell you this isn't working. This performance-based existence isn't sustainable. You need to find your way back to who you actually are. But here's where it gets really difficult. You've been performing for so long, receiving so much validation for the persona that taking off the mask feels like psychological death. Because what if there's nothing underneath? What if the mask is all there is? What if you've performed for so long that you've erased the authentic self completely? This is the terror that keeps people locked in persona identification, even as they're suffering from profound loneliness. They'd rather maintain the familiar performance than risk discovering they have no substance underneath it. So they keep performing, keep seeking validation, keep trying to fill the void with more achievement, more approval, more proof that they matter. But the void doesn't fill, it expands, because validation is addictive. The more you get, the more you need. Each hit of approval provides temporary relief, but no lasting satisfaction. You need bigger achievements, more impressive titles, wider recognition. And you're running faster and faster on a treadmill that goes nowhere, trying to convince yourself and everyone around you that you are the mask you're wearing. Jung understood this trap intimately. He watched it destroy patients, high-functioning, successful people who had everything society said would make them happy, but who were dying inside. Their external lives were impressive, but their internal lives were barren. They had mastered the art of appearing put together while falling apart in private, and the loneliness they experienced wasn't the loneliness of having no people, it was the loneliness of having no self. This is why loneliness often intensifies at the peak of external success. When you finally achieve what you thought would make you happy, when you reach the goal you've been chasing, when you receive the recognition you've been seeking, and you still feel empty, that emptiness is your psyche's way of showing you that the persona cannot deliver what it promises. Achievement cannot fill the void. Approval cannot give you substance. Recognition cannot make you real. David's crisis reached its peak during a business trip. He was in a hotel room in another city, alone after a successful presentation. His phone buzzed with congratulatory texts. His email filled with praise. But sitting there, looking at his reflection in the darkened window, he had a moment of devastating clarity. He had no idea who he was. The face looking back at him was a stranger. The thoughts in his head were borrowed. The emotions he expressed were performed. There was no there, just a collection of reactions designed to produce specific responses in others. That night, David experienced what Jung called the first stage of individuation, the dissolution of persona identification. The mask began to crack, not because he wanted it to, he was terrified, but because his psyche would no longer support the performance. His unconscious was demanding emergence of the authentic self, and it was willing to destroy the false self to make room for the real one. This is where you might be right now. This is what your loneliness might be revealing, not that you're socially inadequate or emotionally broken or fundamentally unlovable, but that you've been living from behind a mask for so long that you've lost contact with your authentic self, and your psyche has initiated a crisis to force you back into genuine self-relationship. The question is, are you going to fight this process and try to repair the mask? Or are you going to let the mask crumble and discover what's underneath it? Because here's what Jung learned. You cannot heal persona-based loneliness by getting better at performing. You cannot fix it by finding people who will validate your mask more enthusiastically. You cannot solve it by achieving even greater external success to prove your worth. The only way through is to stop performing and start being, to stop seeking validation and start seeking self-knowledge, to stop maintaining the persona and start discovering the actual face underneath it. Jung said it clearly. The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. There is no universal persona that will work for everyone. Your job is not to find the perfect mask. It's to remove the mask entirely, to discover who you are when you're not trying to be anything for anybody, to find the face that's been hidden underneath the performance. And that discovery begins in loneliness, in the silence where the mask no longer works, in the isolation where there's no one left to perform for, in the emptiness where you finally have to confront the question, who am I really? David's story doesn't end here. We'll return to him later because his journey through and beyond the persona crisis illustrates the entire arc of transformation. But for now, understand this. If you're experiencing profound loneliness, despite having people in your life, despite appearing successful, despite doing everything right according to social standards, you're not broken. You're being initiated. Your persona is cracking, and what's underneath is waiting to emerge. The pain you're feeling isn't the problem. The pain is the signal. Your loneliness is your psyche's way of saying, the performance is over. It's time to meet who you actually are. There's a critical distinction that Jung spent years helping patients understand, and it's the key to transforming your experience of isolation right now. Loneliness and solitude are not the same thing. They feel similar. They both involve being alone, but psychologically they're opposite states of consciousness. Loneliness is the pain of persona isolation, the feeling of being disconnected from others because you're disconnected from yourself. It's the ache of inauthenticity, the suffering of living behind a mask, the desperate hunger for genuine contact that you cannot achieve because you're not showing up genuinely. Loneliness is the state of being surrounded by people, but feeling utterly alone because no one can see you and you can't see yourself. Solitude, on the other hand, is self-communion. It's the state of being alone but feeling profoundly connected to yourself, to your depths, to the unconscious intelligence that Jung called the self with a capital S. Solitude is not isolation from others. It's integration with yourself. And this integration is exactly what loneliness is demanding of you. Your loneliness is not random suffering. It's encrypted communication from your unconscious. Every feeling of disconnection, every moment of isolation, every experience of invisibility, these are messages. And if you can learn to decode them, they reveal exactly what's missing, what needs attention, what's demanding to be integrated. Jung understood the unconscious not as a dumping ground for repressed trauma, that was Freud's model, but as an intelligent system, with its own wisdom, its own agenda, its own way of communicating. The unconscious knows things your conscious mind doesn't know. It sees patterns you can't see. It understands what you need for your development even when you're consciously pursuing the opposite. And loneliness is one of the primary ways the unconscious gets your attention. Think about it this way. When you're busy, distracted, constantly stimulated, always in relationship with others, your conscious mind dominates. Your ego is in control. You're navigating social reality, managing your persona, responding to external demands. The unconscious recedes into the background. Its messages get drowned out by the noise of daily life. But when you're lonely, when you're isolated, when there's silence and emptiness and no external stimulation to distract you, suddenly the unconscious has space to emerge. The inner voices can finally speak. The dreams become more vivid. The thoughts you've been avoiding surface. The feelings you've been suppressing demand acknowledgement. Loneliness creates the necessary conditions for the unconscious to communicate. This is why so many spiritual traditions involve periods of isolation, desert fathers, Buddhist meditation retreats, vision quests, walkabouts. These aren't punishments, they're purposeful withdrawals from social noise so the inner voice can be heard. Because genuine self-knowledge, authentic transformation, real individuation, none of this happens in the constant chatter of social engagement. It happens in the silence, in the solitude, in the loneliness that becomes communion with self. Jung had a term for this: soul hunger. It's the deep, gnawing ache that people misidentify as need for external connection, when it's actually need for internal connection. You think you're lonely because you don't have the right partner, the right friends, the right community, but what you're actually experiencing is disconnection from your own depths. You're starving for self-relationship, but you're trying to fill that hunger with other people. And it doesn't work. It can't work, because the hunger is for you. Let me give you an example. A woman I'll call Rachel came to understand this after years of serial relationships. She could not be single, could not tolerate being alone. The moment one relationship ended, she was on dating apps, seeking the next one. Not because she loved the men she dated, she often didn't, but because the alternative was unbearable. Being alone meant being with herself, and she had no idea who herself was. Her loneliness manifested not as absence of people, but as presence of the wrong people. She was surrounded by partners who didn't truly see her, by relationships that felt hollow, by connections that left her feeling more alone than when she was actually single. And she kept repeating the pattern because she was trying to solve an internal problem with an external solution. Rachel's breakthrough came during a forced period of solitude, a sabbatical that left her alone for 3 months, with no romantic prospects, no social obligations, nothing but her own company. And at first, it was exactly as unbearable as she feared. The loneliness was crushing. The silence was deafening. The emptiness felt like evidence that she was fundamentally unlovable. But then something shifted. About 6 weeks in, she stopped fighting it, stopped trying to fill the emptiness with calls to friends, with television, with compulsive productivity. She just sat in it. Let it be. And in that surrender, in that allowing, she started to hear something, not an audible voice, but an inner knowing. Thoughts that felt like they came from somewhere deeper than her usual mental chatter. Images in her dreams that felt significant, a sense of her own presence that she'd never experienced before. She was meeting herself for the first time, not the persona Rachel, the one who performed femininity, who managed men's expectations, who shaped herself into whatever her current partner needed. The actual Rachel, the one with her own desires, her own boundaries, her own strange interior landscape that didn't match anyone's expectations. This is what Jung meant when he said, "Your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." The loneliness that drives you to look outside, to seek validation, connection, proof of worthiness from others, keeps you in a dream state. But the loneliness that forces you to look inside, to sit with yourself, to listen to your depths, to allow the unconscious to speak, that loneliness awakens you. So what is your loneliness trying to tell you right now? Let me offer some possibilities based on Jung's framework. If your loneliness feels like being misunderstood, even when you're explaining yourself clearly, your unconscious might be saying, "You're not being honest. You're still performing, still managing how you're perceived, still editing yourself for palatability." The misunderstanding you're experiencing is actually the gap between who you're presenting and who you are. If your loneliness feels like emptiness, even when you're achieving things, your unconscious might be saying, "You're living someone else's definition of success." The goals you're pursuing don't align with your actual values. The life you're building doesn't match the life your soul wants to live. If your loneliness feels like being surrounded by people but feeling invisible, your unconscious might be saying, "You've abandoned yourself to maintain these relationships. You're giving others what they want while ignoring what you need." These connections are one-directional. You're pouring out but not receiving because you're not showing up as someone who can receive. If your loneliness feels like a hollow ache that no amount of social contact can fill, your unconscious might be saying, "You need solitude. You need time alone, not to connect with others. but to connect with yourself. The hunger you're feeling is soul hunger, and trying to satisfy it with social engagement is like trying to quench thirst with salt water. It only makes the need more desperate. These are not intellectual insights. These are messages from your psyche, and they require more than understanding. They require response. Your unconscious doesn't just want you to know what's wrong. It wants you to change. And that change begins with learning to distinguish between loneliness, the pain of disconnection from self, and solitude, the practice of communion with self. Jung developed a specific technique for this: active imagination. We'll explore this in depth in a later chapter, but the basic principle is this. You create space for the unconscious to speak, and then you listen without judgment, without trying to fix or change what emerges. You allow images, feelings, thoughts, inner figures to arise, and you engage with them as if they have their own intelligence, because they do. This is radically different from how most people handle loneliness. Most people try to escape it, distract from it, medicate it, fix it. They treat loneliness as a problem to be solved rather than a message to be decoded. And in doing so, they miss the opportunity loneliness offers, the chance to hear what your unconscious has been trying to tell you all along. I want you to pause here and ask yourself a question, not intellectually, but viscerally. What have you been too busy to hear? What truth about yourself, about your life, about your actual needs and desires has been trying to emerge, but you've been too surrounded by noise and distraction to notice? The answer to that question is why you're lonely right now. Your unconscious has removed the noise. It's forced you into silence, not as punishment, but as gift. Because in that silence, if you're brave enough to listen, you'll finally hear what you need to hear. Jung warned that this process is uncomfortable. He said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." The loneliness you're experiencing is painful precisely because it's forcing you to become conscious of things you've been avoiding, the persona you've maintained, the shadow you've repressed, the authentic desires you've suppressed, the true self you've abandoned. But here's the promise. On the other side of that pain is not more loneliness. On the other side is solitude, the profound comfort of your own company, the deep satisfaction of self-knowledge, the surprising discovery that when you're actually connected to yourself, you're never truly alone. Because the self, that central organizing principle of the psyche that Jung spent his life studying, the self is always present, always available, always offering guidance and wisdom. You just have to get quiet enough to hear it. And loneliness is the silence it creates so you can finally listen. Rachel's story continued in a way that illustrates this perfectly. After her 3 months of solitude, she returned to social life completely changed. Not because she'd learned new social skills or developed a better persona, but because she'd developed relationship with herself. She knew her own boundaries. She understood her own patterns. She could feel when she was abandoning herself to please others. And so her relationships transformed, not because other people changed, but because she stopped betraying herself to maintain connection. The loneliness that had driven her into serial relationships disappeared. Not because she found the right partner, she was actually single for another year after that, but because she was no longer disconnected from herself. She had achieved what Jung called self-relationship, the internal integration that makes external relationship possible without being necessary for survival. This is what your loneliness is calling you toward, not better social skills, not a better persona, not more friends or a more impressive life, but this, genuine self-knowledge, authentic self-relationship, the courage to sit in your own company and discover that you are not empty, you are not broken, you are not unlovable, you are simply unknown to yourself. And loneliness is the invitation to finally make your own acquaintance, Your unconscious is refusing to be ignored anymore. That's what this loneliness is. It's your psyche's way of saying, I'm here, I have things to show you, I have wisdom to share, I have parts of you that have been exiled and need to come home. But you have to stop running, you have to stop distracting, you have to sit still in the discomfort long enough for me to speak. Will you let it speak, or will you keep trying to drown it out with noise, with busyness, with desperate attempts at connection that leave you feeling more alone? The choice is yours, but understand this: the loneliness will not stop until you listen. Your unconscious is more patient than you are, and more powerful. It will keep creating the conditions that force you into silence until you finally hear what it's been trying to tell you all along. You are not here to perform. You are here to become. And that becoming begins in the loneliness that transforms into solitude, the moment you stop running from it and start listening to what it reveals. Now we arrive at the part most people don't want to hear, the part that makes loneliness truly frightening. Because in the silence of isolation, when you're finally alone with yourself, stripped of the persona, unable to distract from your interior, you meet something Jung called the shadow. And the shadow is exactly why most people run from loneliness with such desperation. Let me be very clear about what the shadow is not. It is not your dark side in some simplistic good versus evil binary. It is not the devil on your shoulder. It is not your capacity for evil that you must suppress. The shadow, in Jung's precise definition, is all the parts of yourself that you've disowned, rejected, repressed, or exiled to maintain your self-image and social acceptability. Here's the key. The shadow contains darkness, yes. It contains the rage you've suppressed, the selfishness you've denied, the cruelty you've pretended you're not capable of. But it also contains your power, your authenticity, your vitality, your creative force, your sexual energy, your ambition, your wild, untamed life force that doesn't fit into polite society's expectations. Most people, when they hear about shadow work, think it's about acknowledging your capacity for wrongdoing. And it is, but that's only half of it. The more dangerous encounter, the one that truly transforms you, is discovering that you've also rejected and repressed qualities that are not evil at all, qualities that are actually essential to your wholeness. You've exiled them because they threatened your persona, because they didn't fit the image you needed to maintain, because expressing them would have gotten you rejected by your family or culture or social group. Let me tell you about Sarah. Sarah was a therapist, empathetic, nurturing, always available to help others with their problems. Everyone loved Sarah. She was the friend who listened, the counselor who cared, the person you called when you needed support. Her entire identity was built on being helpful, kind, selfless. That was her persona, and it worked beautifully until it didn't. Sarah's loneliness began in her mid-30s. Despite being surrounded by clients who needed her, friends who called her, family who depended on her, she felt utterly alone, invisible, used, and she couldn't understand why. She was doing everything right. She was being good. She was helping people. Why did she feel so disconnected? Her crisis deepened during a period when circumstances forced her into isolation, the illness that required bed rest, weeks alone with nothing but her own thoughts. And in that isolation, something emerged that terrified her: rage, not the acceptable anger of someone who's been wronged, deep, murderous, apocalyptic rage at her clients for their neediness, at her friends for only calling when they wanted something, at her family for taking and never giving, at the world for requiring her to be endlessly nurturing while she was dying inside. And underneath that rage, something even more frightening: ambition, raw, unapologetic, selfish ambition. She didn't want to help people anymore. She wanted to be powerful. She wanted to be seen not as a helper, but as a force. She wanted to stop giving and start taking. She wanted to be admired not for her kindness, but for her brilliance and strength. These were Sarah's shadow qualities, and they had been there all along, pressed down, locked away, denied existence because they directly contradicted the persona she'd built. The kind therapist couldn't be rageful. The nurturing friend couldn't be selfish. The selfless daughter couldn't be ambitious. So those parts of her went underground. They moved into the shadow, and here's what Jung discovered that changes everything. The shadow doesn't disappear just because you refuse to acknowledge it. It doesn't politely wait in the background. No, the shadow has its own energy, its own drive, its own demand for expression. And when you refuse its conscious expression, it finds unconscious expression. It leaks out sideways. It manifests as symptoms. For Sarah, the shadow leaked out as loneliness, because the shadow contains not just what you've rejected in yourself, but also what you project onto others. When you're cut off from your own power, you unconsciously give your power away to others. When you're cut off from your own rage, you become the passive recipient of others' anger. When you're cut off from your own ambition, you end up serving others' ambitions while abandoning your own. This is why loneliness often accompanies shadow repression. You're not actually connecting with people. You're connecting with projections. You're relating to who you think they are, or who you need them to be, or who they would be if they contained the qualities you've disowned. But you're not seeing them clearly. And they're not seeing you clearly, because the real you, the whole you, includes the shadow. And as long as the shadow remains unconscious, genuine intimacy is impossible. Jung said it clearly. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. The more you deny the shadow, the more powerful it becomes. The more you reject parts of yourself, the more those parts dominate your unconscious behavior. You think you're in control because you've successfully suppressed these qualities. But you're not in control. The shadow is controlling you from behind the scenes. Let me give you a framework for understanding your own shadow. Jung taught a technique called shadow mapping, and here's how it works. Step 1. Notice your projections. Pay attention to what you judge most harshly in others. The colleague who's too ambitious. Why does their ambition bother you so much? The friend who's selfish. What is it about their self-prioritization that triggers you? The family member who never listens. Why does their inattention feel like a personal attack? These judgments are mirrors. What you cannot tolerate in others is often what you've rejected in yourself. Step 2. Identify the pattern. Look at your relationships and notice what keeps showing up. Do you keep attracting people who take advantage of your kindness? That might mean you're projecting the user quality you've disowned, your own capacity to prioritize your needs over others. Do you keep encountering people who seem more powerful than you? That might mean you've projected your power onto them because you're too afraid to claim it yourself. Step 3. Feel the forbidden feeling. This is the hardest part. You have to actually allow yourself to feel the quality you've been rejecting. If you've denied your rage, you have to let yourself feel angry. If you've rejected your selfishness, you have to let yourself want things without shame. If you've suppressed your sexuality, you have to let yourself feel desire without guilt. This doesn't mean acting on every feeling. It means acknowledging the feeling's existence and right to exist. Step 4. Reintegrate with consciousness. Once you've acknowledged the shadow quality, you can make conscious choices about it. This is the crucial distinction. Integrating the shadow doesn't mean becoming your worst impulses. It means bringing those impulses into conscious awareness so you can choose what to do with them. Sarah didn't become a rageful monster when she acknowledged her anger. She became someone who could set boundaries. She didn't become ruthlessly ambitious when she acknowledged that drive. She became someone who could pursue her own goals alongside helping others. But here's what makes the shadow work so difficult, and why loneliness is often the only force strong enough to make us do it. Facing the shadow requires you to admit you're not who you thought you were. The image you have of yourself, the story you tell about your personality, your values, your character, that story is incomplete at best, and at worst, it's a lie. The real you includes the parts you've been denying, and accepting that means shattering the comfortable illusion of your own goodness, your own innocence, your own moral superiority. Jung was very direct about this. How can I be substantial if I do not cast a shadow? I must have a dark side also if I am to be whole. Wholeness requires shadow integration. You cannot become your full self while rejecting half of yourself. And the half you've rejected is often the half that contains your power, your vitality, your creative force. This is why loneliness creates the ideal conditions for shadow work. When you're alone, there's no one to project onto, there's no one to blame, there's no one to cast as the villain so you can maintain your role as the hero. You're forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that the darkness you see in the world, the qualities you despise in others, the behaviors you judge most harshly, all of that exists within you too. Sarah's transformation illustrates this perfectly. In her isolation, when she finally stopped running from the rage and ambition she felt, something remarkable happened. She didn't become less empathetic, she became more genuinely empathetic, because now her empathy wasn't a performance designed to earn love. It was a conscious choice she made from a place of wholeness. She set boundaries with clients who drained her. She ended friendships that were one-sided. She started pursuing her own career ambitions instead of always supporting others' dreams. And here's the paradox. People didn't abandon her. They respected her more. Her relationships deepened because now she was showing up as a whole person, not a partial person playing a role. This is what Jung meant by shadow integration, not becoming your darkness, but becoming complete. Not indulging your worst impulses, but acknowledging that you have them. Not acting out every selfish desire, but admitting you have desires. The integrated person is not more virtuous than the unintegrated person. They're just more honest about containing both light and shadow. And here's the truly dangerous knowledge. The biggest shadow elements aren't usually your bad qualities. They're often the good qualities you rejected because your family or culture or social group couldn't tolerate them. Maybe you're actually brilliant, but you had to play dumb to fit in with peers who felt threatened by intelligence. So brilliance went into your shadow. Maybe you're naturally confident, but you were raised in a family that punished self-assurance as arrogance. So confidence went into your shadow. Maybe you're powerfully sexual, but you grew up in a culture that shamed sexuality. So your erotic life force went into your shadow. These exiled qualities don't disappear, they haunt you. They emerge as the people you're attracted to. You're drawn to confident people because they embody the confidence you rejected. They emerge as the people you envy. You resent successful people because they express the ambition you suppressed. They emerge as fantasies, as dreams, as the life you imagine for yourself but never claim because claiming it would mean admitting you're not who you've been pretending to be. And loneliness, this particular species of loneliness you're experiencing right now, is often your psyche's way of forcing shadow integration. Because when you're alone, when the persona doesn't work, when there's no one to perform for and no one to project onto, the shadow emerges. The parts of you that you've been denying demand acknowledgement. The qualities you've rejected insist on being seen. You have three choices in this moment. Choice 1, run. Fill the silence with noise, the isolation with desperate connection, the discomfort with distraction. Refuse to meet the shadow. This is what most people choose, and it works temporarily, but the loneliness returns, often stronger because the shadow's demand for integration doesn't go away, it intensifies. Choice 2, identify with the shadow. Let the pendulum swing completely the other direction. Sarah could have done this. Left therapy entirely, burned all her relationships, pursued ambition ruthlessly without any empathy. Some people do this. They meet the shadow and think, this is the real me, and then act out every repressed impulse. This is not integration. It's just replacing one partial identity with another partial identity. Choice 3. Integrate. Acknowledge the shadow without becoming it. Admit you contain rage without being ruled by rage. Recognize your ambition without abandoning your values. Feel your sexuality without letting it dominate your decisions. This is the narrow path Jung taught. Not repression, not indulgence, but conscious integration. And integration requires something very specific. You have to give up your moral superiority. You have to admit you're capable of the things you judge in others. You have to acknowledge that the line between good and evil doesn't run between you and other people. It runs through your own heart. Jung put it this way: knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. When you've met your own shadow, when you've acknowledged your own capacity for cruelty, selfishness, rage, manipulation, you can no longer judge others from a position of moral superiority. You understand that we're all struggling with the same forces. We're all containing multiplicity. We're all more complex than we pretend to be. This is actually liberating, because moral superiority is exhausting to maintain. The constant work of pretending you're better than, different from, more evolved than, it's a prison. And shadow integration is the key that unlocks it. You don't have to be the hero anymore. You don't have to be perfectly good. You just have to be honest about what you are, a human being containing both light and darkness, both virtue and vice, both angel and animal. Sarah described it like this: I spent 30 years trying to be good. I spent 3 months in isolation discovering I'm not good, I'm real. And real is so much better than good because real can actually connect. Good is just another performance. This is the gift waiting in your loneliness, if you're brave enough to receive it. The shadow integration that makes you whole. The acknowledgement of your full humanity that ends the exhausting performance of partial perfection. The meeting with the disowned parts of yourself that returns you to authenticity. But you have to stop running. You have to sit in the silence. You have to let the shadow emerge. And when it does, when you feel the rage, the ambition, the selfishness, the desire, the power, whatever you've been repressing, you have to resist 2 temptations: the temptation to suppress it again and the temptation to identify with it completely. Instead, you say, this is also me, not all of me, but part of me, and I can integrate this part without being consumed by it. That's the narrow path. That's the alchemical transformation Jung spent his life teaching, and loneliness is often the crucible where that transformation happens, because you cannot integrate the shadow while you're performing the persona. You cannot meet your full self while you're pretending to be a partial self. You cannot become whole while you're presenting yourself as good. The shadow is waiting in your isolation, not to destroy you, to complete you. The question is, will you meet it? There's a phase of this process that Jung understood intimately because he lived it. A phase that mystics throughout history have called the dark night of the soul, a phase that alchemists symbolized as nigredo, the blackening, the death, the dissolution. Jung had a more clinical term for it, the breakdown that precedes individuation. Individuation. Let's pause on this word because it's the destination your loneliness is pointing toward, but most people misunderstand what it means. Individuation is not self-improvement. It's not becoming a better version of yourself. It's not personal development or optimization or any kind of enhancement of your current identity. Individuation is becoming who you actually are underneath all the layers of conditioning, all the masks of persona, all the projections and identifications and inherited beliefs that have been covering your authentic self. Jung said, individuation means becoming an individual, and insofar as individuality embraces our innermost, last, and incomparable uniqueness, it also implies becoming one's own self. We could therefore translate individuation as coming to selfhood or self-realization. Coming to selfhood, not improving your current self, but discovering and becoming your actual self. And here's what makes this process so difficult. Becoming your actual self requires the death of your false self. The persona must die. The identifications must dissolve. The borrowed beliefs must crumble. Everything you thought you were has to fall apart before what you actually are can emerge. This is the dark night, and it has stages. Jung observed these stages in his own breakdown and in countless patients who went through similar transformations. Understanding these stages won't make the process less painful, but it might help you recognize that what feels like insanity or collapse is actually the necessary destruction that precedes creation. Stage 1. Disintegration. This is where you are right now if you're experiencing profound loneliness. The old identity is crumbling. The persona isn't working anymore. The beliefs you've held about yourself, about life, about meaning and purpose, they're revealed as insufficient or false. You feel like you're falling apart, and you are. But what's falling apart is the constructed self, not the actual self. The problem is, you've identified with the constructed self for so long that its dissolution feels like your dissolution. David, the executive from Chapter 2, hit full disintegration 6 months after his promotion party. One morning he woke up and could not make himself go to work. Not didn't want to, could not. His body refused. The performance he'd been maintaining for 20 years suddenly became impossible to sustain. He called in sick, then called in sick again. By the 3rd week, he'd stopped answering his phone. His colleagues thought he was having a breakdown. They were right, but not the kind they imagined. What was breaking down was his identification with David the executive. That identity, which had been so solid, so clear, so functional, it just stopped being available to him. He couldn't put on the suit, couldn't adopt the confident tone, couldn't access the personality he'd inhabited. It was as if the actor had walked off stage and couldn't make himself return to the role. This is disintegration, and it feels like death because it is death. Death of the false self. But in our culture, we pathologize this. We call it depression, anxiety, breakdown. We medicate it. We try to restore the person to their previous functioning. And sometimes that's necessary for safety. But Jung understood that often what looks like pathology is actually transformation. What looks like mental illness is actually the psyche's intelligent dismantling of a structure that no longer serves growth. Stage 2. Disorientation. After disintegration comes a period of complete loss of reference points. You don't know who you are anymore. The old identity is gone, but the new one hasn't emerged yet. You're in between personas, between identities, between worlds. Nothing makes sense. The beliefs that used to orient you don't work anymore. The goals that used to motivate you seem meaningless. The relationships that used to sustain you feel hollow. This is the most dangerous phase because it's when people often abort the process. They panic at the loss of structure and grab for anything that will give them back a sense of identity, sometimes even worse identities than the ones they had. They might develop addictions, enter destructive relationships, join cults or extreme ideologies, anything to escape the unbearable uncertainty of not knowing who they are. Jung himself experienced this profoundly after his break with Freud. He wrote in his autobiography, "An incessant stream of fantasies had been released, and I did my best not to lose my head, but to find some way to understand these strange things. I stood helpless before an alien world. Everything in it seemed difficult and incomprehensible. He didn't know if he was experiencing a creative breakthrough or a psychotic break. He had no map, no guide, no way to distinguish between the disintegration of his ego and the emergence of something deeper. He was completely disoriented, and that disorientation lasted for years. But he didn't abort. He stayed in it. He recorded his visions in the Red Book. He dialogued with the figures that appeared to him. He let the process unfold without trying to control it or escape it. And this is the critical choice in the disorientation phase. Do you trust the process or do you run from it? Trusting the process doesn't mean passive acceptance. It means active engagement with the chaos. It means paying attention to dreams, to synchronicities, to the symbols that emerge. It means journaling, creating, dialoguing with the unconscious. It means holding the tension of not knowing without collapsing into comfortable but false certainty. Stage 3, dormancy. This is the phase least understood and most difficult to endure. After the dramatic disintegration and the chaotic disorientation comes nothing, flatness, a sense of waiting but not knowing what you're waiting for. The alchemists called this the mortificatio, the deadening. It feels like you're in a cocoon, in a tomb, in stasis. Nothing is happening, nothing is changing. You're just suspended in empty time. This is actually when the deepest transformation is occurring, but it's invisible and unfelt. It's like seeds in winter. From above ground, nothing appears to be happening. But underground, in the darkness, in the cold, the essential work of germination is taking place. Break the seed open too soon and you kill it. Rush the process and you abort the transformation. David spent 4 months in dormancy. He'd stopped going to work, stopped socializing, stopped doing much of anything. He wasn't depressed exactly. He was just waiting. His savings were running out. His career was obviously over. His relationships were strained. But something in him refused to go back to the old performance, and something in him couldn't yet move forward into whatever was next. So he waited. His friends thought he'd given up. His family pressured him to get help. But David was actually doing the deepest work of his life. He just couldn't see it or articulate it. He was allowing the death of David the executive to be complete. He was letting the false self fully dissolve before trying to construct a new one. He was in the necessary darkness that precedes rebirth. Jung warned about the temptation to abort this process. He called it enantiodromia, the tendency of things to transform into their opposite. Right at the moment of deepest transformation, right when you're closest to breakthrough, there's a powerful pull to retreat into the familiar. The discomfort becomes unbearable. The uncertainty feels unendurable. And the old life, despite having made you miserable, suddenly looks attractive again. This is the comfort abort trap. You think, maybe it wasn't so bad. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I should just go back to normal. And normal means back to the persona, back to the performance, back to the unconscious life you were living before the crisis. And if you abort here, you'll have experienced all the pain of breakdown without any of the benefit of breakthrough. You'll have endured the dark night without reaching the dawn. History is full of examples of people who went through this process and didn't abort. Jung himself, obviously, but also Nietzsche, who spent years in isolation and illness before writing his most profound works. Rumi, who fell into a deep depression after the death of Shams and emerged as one of history's greatest mystical poets. Eckhart Tolle, who sat on a park bench for 2 years after his psychological breakdown before his awakening. St. John of the Cross, who literally wrote Dark Night of the Soul while imprisoned. These weren't weak people who couldn't handle normal life. These were individuals whose psyches demanded something more than normal life could offer. They were being called to individuation, to becoming fully themselves, and that calling required a death and rebirth process that couldn't be rushed or skipped. The pattern is always the same: comfortable unconsciousness, crisis that breaks the comfort, disintegration of old identity, disorientation in the void, dormancy in the darkness, emergence of new identity, integration of transformation. But here's what's crucial to understand. You cannot skip steps. You cannot shortcut the process. You cannot meditate your way around disintegration, or positive think your way through disorientation, or hustle your way out of dormancy. Each phase has its own necessity. Each stage serves a purpose, and trying to speed through them only ensures you'll have to repeat them later, often more painfully. Jung put it starkly: there is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Making the darkness conscious, that's the work of the dark night. Not escaping the darkness, not denying it, not spiritually bypassing it with premature transcendence, but staying in it, exploring it, allowing it to do its work on you. The darkness isn't punishment, it's gestation. It's the womb where the new self is forming, and you cannot birth yourself before the gestation is complete. So if you're in this now, if you're experiencing disintegration or disorientation or dormancy, understand that you're not broken, you're not failing, you're not regressing or wasting time or losing your life. You're in an ancient archetypal process that every individuating human must undergo. The form it takes is unique to you, but the process itself is universal. The question isn't whether you'll experience the dark night. If you're being called to consciousness, you will. The question is whether you'll trust it, whether you'll stay in it long enough for the transformation to complete, whether you'll resist the comfort abort trap and keep holding the tension of not knowing until something genuinely new emerges. Because here's the promise Jung discovered through his own dark night and verified through decades of clinical work. On the other side of this process is not just relief, not just return to normal functioning, it's genuine transformation. It's becoming who you actually are. It's living from your center instead of from your circumference. It's a quality of aliveness and authenticity that you could not access while you were still identified with the false self. But you have to complete the process. You have to let the death be death before you can experience the rebirth. You have to endure the darkness before you can emerge into a light that's actually yours, not borrowed from others' expectations. David's dormancy ended not dramatically but quietly. One morning he woke up and felt something he hadn't felt in years: curiosity. Not about returning to his corporate career, but about something else. He'd been sketching during his months of isolation. Nothing serious, just idle drawings. But that morning he felt genuine interest in improving, in learning more, in seeing where this might lead. This was the first green shoot of his new identity emerging. Not David the executive, someone else, someone authentic, someone who hadn't existed before, because there hadn't been room for him. The old David had to die completely before this new person could be born. That's the dark night. That's the negredo. That's the necessary dissolution before individuation. And if you're in it right now, if your old identity is crumbling and your new identity hasn't emerged yet, don't run, don't abort, don't try to speed through it or skip it or medicate it away. Stay, wait. Trust the darkness, because something is being forged in that darkness that could never be forged in the light. Your actual self is forming in the womb of your loneliness, and it will emerge when the gestation is complete, not before. But inevitably, if you don't abort the process, the dawn is coming, but only if you stop running from the night. There's a principle in Jung's psychology that sounds paradoxical until you experience it directly: enantiodromia. It's a Greek term meaning running counter to. Jung used it to describe how things transform into their opposite when they reach their extreme point, hot becomes cold, love becomes hate, and loneliness, when taken to its extreme depth, when fully experienced rather than fled from, transforms into something unexpected. Solitude. But not just solitude, creative, generative, revelatory solitude. The loneliness that feels like curse becomes the solitude that functions as blessing, but only if you stop resisting it, only if you allow the enantiodromia to occur naturally, rather than fighting to maintain one pole of the tension. Let me be very direct about what I'm about to share. I'm not going to give you the toxic positivity version where everything happens for a reason, and your pain is a gift. That's spiritual bypassing, and Jung would have rejected it completely. Your pain is real. Your suffering is genuine. The loneliness you're experiencing is awful, and I will not pretend otherwise. But, and this is crucial, within that genuine suffering there are actual gifts, not silver linings, not hidden blessings that make the suffering worthwhile, but practical, concrete benefits that only become available through the specific process of loneliness into solitude. And you can access these benefits without pretending the pain wasn't real or necessary. The first gift? Clarity. When you're embedded in social relationships, constantly navigating other people's needs and expectations, managing your persona across multiple contexts, your perception is inherently compromised. You're seeing the world through the lens of, what do they need me to be? And that lens distorts everything. But in loneliness, in isolation, when there's no one to perform for, that lens cracks. Suddenly you can see things you couldn't see before. Suddenly you can think thoughts that social pressure had made unthinkable. Suddenly you can feel feelings you'd been suppressing to maintain harmony. David, during his months of isolation, began to see his entire career with devastating clarity. How he'd chosen it to please his father, how every promotion had made him more miserable, how the prestige had nothing to do with his actual values. This clarity wasn't available to him while he was embedded in that world. He had to be removed from it, forced into isolation, before he could see it clearly. The second gift, creativity. Jung wrote extensively about the relationship between solitude and creative emergence. He said, "The creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct acting from inner necessity. The creative mind plays with the objects it loves. That play instinct cannot emerge in social noise. It requires space, silence, the kind of unstructured, unobserved time that loneliness provides. When you're alone, when no one is watching, when there's no expectation to perform or produce, the unconscious can play. It can generate images, ideas, connections that would be impossible in a socially conditioned state. Look at the biographies of creative people across history. Almost universally, their most generative periods followed periods of isolation. Not comfortable solitude they chose, but forced isolation they had to endure. Virginia Woolf, Emily Dickinson, Vincent van Gogh, Nikola Tesla. They weren't more creative despite their isolation. They were more creative because of it. The third gift, courage. This one seems counterintuitive. Isn't loneliness supposed to make you weaker, more dependent, more desperate for connection? It does, initially. But if you stay in it long enough, if you survive the terror of your own company, something shifts. You discover you can survive alone. You discover that exile isn't death. You discover that you don't actually need external validation to exist. And that discovery is profoundly liberating, because once you know you can survive alone, once you've touched bottom and found its solid ground, you're no longer afraid of rejection in the same way. You can speak truth that might get you rejected, because rejection is no longer the ultimate threat. You can set boundaries that might end relationships, because you know relationship isn't worth the price of self-abandonment. This courage isn't bravado or confidence. It's something deeper, the quiet certainty that comes from having faced your worst fear, being alone, and discovering you're still here. You survived the thing you thought would kill you, and now everything else is negotiable. Sarah discovered this after her period of isolation. When she returned to her practice, she was unrecognizable to her colleagues. She said no. She charged what she was worth. She ended sessions when time was up instead of giving extra time. She didn't explain herself or apologize for having boundaries. And to her surprise, her practice thrived. People respected her more, not less, because she'd developed the courage that only comes from being willing to be alone. The fourth gift, discernment. In social contexts, you learn to read people, to anticipate reactions, to manage impressions. These are useful skills, but they come at a cost. You lose the ability to discern what you actually feel versus what you think you should feel. You lose contact with your own authentic responses. Loneliness, especially prolonged loneliness, strips away that social conditioning. You start to notice the difference between genuine desire and borrowed desire, between authentic enthusiasm and performed enthusiasm, between real connection and obligatory interaction. This discernment is invaluable. It allows you to return to social life, able to tell the difference between people who see you and people who see your persona, between relationships that nourish you and relationships that drain you, between opportunities that align with your actual self and opportunities that serve your false self. You develop what Jung called an interior compass, the ability to navigate by your own truth rather than by social consensus. And that compass only gets calibrated in isolation, where external signals are removed and internal signals can finally be heard. The fifth gift, authenticity. This is the cumulative effect of all the other gifts, the clarity that lets you see what's real, the creativity that lets you express what's real, the courage that lets you embody what's real, the discernment that lets you protect what's real. Authenticity isn't a performance. It's not being yourself in some performative sense. It's the quiet, unforced expression of your actual nature once the persona has been stripped away. And it only emerges after loneliness has done its work of removing everything false. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not to become something impressive, not to become someone others admire, but to become who you truly are. And that becoming requires the loneliness that strips away who you're not." Now, here's the critical piece. How do you know if you're actually receiving these gifts, or if you're just suffering without transformation? How do you distinguish between loneliness that's destroying you and loneliness that's initiating you? I'm going to give you what I call the integration test. 5 questions that reveal whether your loneliness is becoming solitude, whether your suffering is becoming transformation. Question 1. Are you more curious or more bitter? If your loneliness is making you increasingly resentful of people who seem less alone, of the world for your isolation, of yourself for your worthlessness, that's regression, not transformation. But if you're becoming more curious about yourself, about consciousness, about the patterns you're noticing, that's the sign transformation is occurring. Question 2. Are you more honest or more hidden? If your isolation is making you retreat further into fantasy, into denial, into constructed narratives about why you're special or why everyone else is wrong, that's defensive, not transformative. But if you're becoming more honest with yourself about your shadow, your patterns, your genuine feelings, that's integration. Question 3. Are you more compassionate or more judgmental? This one's tricky because initial shadow work often makes you more judgmental temporarily as you project your newly discovered darkness onto others. But if you're staying with the process, you move through judgment toward compassion. Not naive compassion that ignores darkness, but mature compassion that recognizes we're all struggling with the same forces. Question 4. Are you more creative or more consuming? If your isolation is filled with consuming content, endless scrolling, binge-watching, compulsive reading of self-help, that's distraction, not integration. But if you're creating, writing, drawing, building, making anything, that's the sign the unconscious is beginning to flow. Creation is how the psyche processes transformation. Question 5. Are you more waiting or more active? There's a necessary dormancy period, as we discussed. But if you're completely passive, completely waiting for something external to save you, that's stagnation. If you're actively engaging with your interior through journaling, active imagination, honest self-examination, that's the active phase of transformation. Even if externally it looks like doing nothing, be honest with yourself about these questions. They're not about judgment, they're about calibration. They help you tell whether you're in the transformative phase of loneliness or stuck in its destructive phase. And if you're stuck, they show you where you need to redirect your energy. I want to share something personal here, something I haven't spoken about publicly before. About 7 years ago, I went through my own period of profound loneliness. I'd built what looked like a successful life, work I was respected for, relationships that seemed meaningful. But underneath, I was hollow, performing, exhausted. The crisis came during a period when circumstances forced me into isolation, a sabbatical that left me alone for 3 months, with no obligations, no structure, nothing but my own company. And I was terrified, because I didn't know who I was when I wasn't performing for others. I'd been so busy being what others needed that I'd never asked what I needed, who I was, what I actually wanted. Those 3 months were brutal. I thought I was having a breakdown. I questioned everything I'd built. I felt like I was dying. But somewhere in the 2nd month, something shifted. I stopped fighting it, stopped trying to fix it. Just let myself be in the emptiness, the uncertainty, the not knowing. And in that surrender, things started emerging. Not answers, but questions that felt genuinely mine for the first time. Not solutions, but curiosities that felt alive. I started writing, not for publication, just for myself. I started noticing patterns in my life I'd never seen. I started feeling anger I'd suppressed, ambition I'd denied, desires I'd abandoned. By the end of those 3 months, I wasn't fixed. I was still uncertain, still in process, but I was real in a way I hadn't been before. And when I returned to social life, everything had changed. Not because people changed, but because I'd changed. I couldn't perform the old role anymore. I couldn't maintain the old mask. So relationships either deepened into genuine connection or ended because they'd only been based on my performance. I'm telling you this because I want you to know the gifts are real. They're not compensation for suffering. They're the natural result of allowing suffering to complete its work. But you have to stay in it. You have to resist the urge to abort, to distract, to numb. You have to trust that the loneliness that feels like it's destroying you is actually refining you. Jung used alchemical metaphors constantly because alchemy perfectly captures the psychological process of transformation. The alchemists weren't trying to turn lead into gold, literally. They were describing the process of transforming base consciousness into refined consciousness. And every alchemical process begins with calcination, burning away impurities. Then comes dissolution, breaking down rigid structures. Then comes separation, distinguishing what's essential from what's not. Your loneliness is the fire of calcination. It's burning away the false self, the persona, the borrowed beliefs. It hurts because burning hurts. But what remains after the burning is pure. What survives the fire is real. and that reality is worth the pain of purification. But here's the warning Jung always gave. You cannot skip the pain and go straight to the gifts. You cannot bypass the dark night and arrive at dawn. The gifts only emerge through the full experience of the suffering. If you numb it, distract from it, medicate it away, you abort the transformation. You get stuck in suffering without transformation. This is why so many people are stuck in chronic loneliness. They're experiencing the pain but not allowing the process to complete. They're constantly interrupting the transformation with attempts to return to normal, to fix themselves, to escape back into comfortable unconsciousness. And so they suffer endlessly without ever receiving the gifts their suffering is trying to deliver. The path through is counterintuitive. You have to stop trying to fix the loneliness and start listening to it. Stop asking, how do I make this stop? And start asking, what is this trying to show me? Stop treating it as enemy and start treating it as teacher. Jung wrote, the most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm, which is not easily disturbed, or else a brokenness that can hardly be healed. Conversely, it is just these intense conflicts and their conflagration which are needed in order to produce valuable and lasting results. Intense conflicts, conflagration, these aren't pleasant words, but they're honest words. The transformation Jung is describing isn't gentle or comfortable, it's fire, and you have to be willing to burn if you want to be refined. So here's what I'm asking you to do. Stop trying to escape your loneliness. Stop treating it as a problem to be solved. Stop judging yourself for being in it. Instead, ask, what is this loneliness revealing? What clarity is emerging? What creativity wants to flow? What courage is being forged? What discernment is developing? What authenticity is trying to emerge? These questions shift loneliness from passive suffering to active transformation. They turn you from victim of circumstance into participant in your own individuation. They reframe the darkness from meaningless pain into meaningful initiation. And when you make that shift, when you stop resisting and start receiving, the enantiodromia occurs. The loneliness that felt like curse transforms into the solitude that functions as blessing. Not because the pain disappears, but because it stops being random suffering and becomes purposeful transformation. David described it like this: months after his dormancy period ended, I spent years trying to not be alone because I thought loneliness meant I was broken. Then I spent months being forced to be alone and discovering that loneliness was actually the breaking open that needed to happen. The person I was couldn't hold the person I needed to become. The old container had to shatter, and now I'm grateful for every moment of that terrible loneliness, because it destroyed a life I was dying in and gave me space to build a life I actually want to live. This is the promise hidden in your pain. Not that the pain wasn't real, not that the suffering will magically feel good in retrospect, but that the suffering will prove to have been meaningful. It will prove to have served a purpose. It will prove to have delivered you into a life more authentic, more aligned, more genuinely yours than the one you were living before. But only if you let it complete its work. Only if you stay in the fire long enough for the purification to finish. Only if you resist the comfort abort trap and trust that what's being destroyed needed to be destroyed so what's essential can emerge. The gifts are real. The clarity, the creativity, the courage, the discernment, the authenticity, they're waiting on the other side of your willingness to stop running and start receiving. Your loneliness is not punishment. It's preparation. And if you can hold that perspective, even in your darkest moments, you'll discover something Jung spent his life proving. The psyche is not trying to destroy you. It's trying to birth you, and birth is always painful, always messy, always terrifying. But what emerges is life, real life, your life. So stay in it, not forever. The process does complete. But for now, While you're in the fire, while you're in the darkness, while you're in the loneliness that hasn't yet transformed into solitude, stay, trust, allow. The gifts are forming in the darkness, even if you can't feel them yet. And when you emerge, you'll be carrying treasures you could have acquired no other way. Jung's final word on this: I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become. Your loneliness happened to you, but what you become through it, that's your choice. You can let it destroy you by resisting the process, or you can let it transform you by allowing the process. The pain is the same either way, but the outcome depends entirely on whether you fight the fire or let it refine you. Choose transformation. Choose to receive the gifts. Choose to trust that your psyche knows what it's doing, even when your ego is terrified. That choice made in the midst of suffering is the difference between loneliness that breaks you and loneliness that makes you. Now we need to talk about something uncomfortable, something that might fundamentally change how you view your loneliness and your place in the social order. Because here's what Jung discovered that makes his work genuinely subversive. Your individuation, your becoming who you truly are, threatens the collective, and the collective will resist it, subtly and overtly, through mechanisms so deeply embedded in culture that most people never recognize them. Let me start with a foundational concept. Jung distinguished between two forms of consciousness: collective consciousness and individual consciousness. Collective consciousness is the shared set of beliefs, values, norms, and behaviors that define a group, a culture, a society. It's what everyone knows without being taught explicitly. It's the water that fish don't know they're swimming in. It's the invisible operating system running in the background of every social interaction. Collective consciousness is not evil. It's necessary. It's how societies function, how groups coordinate, how culture transmits itself across generations. Without collective consciousness, there would be no shared reality, no common language, no basis for cooperation. Children need to be socialized into collective consciousness to function in the world. But, and this is crucial, collective consciousness requires conformity. It requires individuals to suppress their unique perspectives, their authentic desires, their genuine questions, in favor of the consensus reality. And here's the key: collective consciousness is largely unconscious. People don't choose most of their beliefs and behaviors. They absorb them from the collective and then defend them as if they were personally arrived at truths. Individual consciousness, in Jung's framework, is something different entirely. It's the state of being aware of your own conditioning, of seeing the collective assumptions you've internalized, of distinguishing between what you actually think versus what you've been taught to think. It's consciousness that knows itself as consciousness, that can observe its own thoughts and beliefs and ask, is this actually mine, or is this borrowed from the collective? And here's the problem: individual consciousness destabilizes collective consciousness. The individuated person, the one who's done the shadow work, integrated the persona, survived the dark night, becomes a kind of irritant to the social body. Not because they're intentionally rebellious, but because their authenticity highlights others' inauthenticity. Their consciousness makes others' unconsciousness uncomfortable. Their refusal to perform exposes the performative nature of social reality. Jung wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." But collective consciousness insists there is a recipe. It demands conformity because conformity is what makes the collective predictable, manageable, controllable. The individuated person threatens this by demonstrating that another way is possible, that you can opt out of the consensus reality and survive. In fact, that you can thrive. This is why loneliness is often socially induced. Not always consciously, but the mechanism is clear. When someone begins questioning collective assumptions, begins withdrawing their energy from collective performances, begins prioritizing their own truth over social comfort. The collective punishes them with isolation. They get excluded from groups. They stop getting invitations. People become uncomfortable around them, not because they're hostile or difficult, but because their consciousness is contagious, and the collective instinctively quarantines what threatens its unconscious stability. Think about what happens when someone genuinely changes, not performs change, but actually transforms. When someone who was people-pleasing develops boundaries. When someone who was performing success admits it's hollow. When someone who was playing a role steps out of character, the people around them don't celebrate. They resist. They try to pull the person back into the old pattern. "You've changed," they say, and it's an accusation, not an observation. Why? Because the changed person threatens the unchanged people. If you can break free from the performance, what does that say about those still performing? If you can survive without their approval, what does that say about their dependence on approval? If you can face your shadow and integrate it, what does that say about their continued repression of their shadow? Your awakening implicates their sleep, and people will do almost anything to protect their right to remain unconscious. Jung called this the collective psychosis, the shared delusional reality that groups maintain by punishing anyone who threatens to wake up. And the punishment is isolation. The punishment is loneliness. The punishment is being cast out of the tribe for daring to become conscious. Now, this is where it gets really controversial, but Jung was clear about it. Much of what we call mental illness is actually the psyche's rebellion against collective consciousness. Not all of it. Jung wasn't anti-psychiatry, but he recognized that many psychological symptoms emerge when the authentic self is being suffocated by collective demands. The anxiety isn't irrational. It's the fear of being yourself in a world that punishes authenticity. The depression isn't chemical. It's the natural response to living a false life. The loneliness isn't pathological. It's exile from a collective you can no longer participate in unconsciously. Let me tell you about Marcus, a man who experienced this directly. Marcus was a successful lawyer in a conservative firm. He had the career, the marriage, the house in the suburbs, the entire package of collective success. But in his early 40s, something cracked. He started questioning things, not rebelliously, but genuinely. Why am I doing this? Who chose this life? What do I actually want? These questions alone were enough to trigger social exile. His colleagues sensed his questioning and began excluding him from important cases. His wife became threatened by his introspection and accused him of having a midlife crisis. His parents expressed disappointment that he was throwing away everything they'd worked to give him. He wasn't throwing anything away, he was just starting to wake up. But to the collective, waking up looks like breakdown. Marcus's loneliness intensified as he continued questioning. Old friends stopped calling. Social invitations dried up. Even his therapist seemed uncomfortable with his questions, kept trying to get him to focus on coping skills rather than fundamental questioning. The message from every direction was clear. Stop questioning, get back in line, resume the performance. But Marcus couldn't. Once you start waking up, you cannot voluntarily go back to sleep. You can numb yourself, distract yourself, pretend you're still sleeping, but the consciousness, once sparked, doesn't extinguish. And so Marcus found himself in a specific species of loneliness that Jung recognized immediately, the loneliness of the awakening person in the sleeping world. This is different from other forms of loneliness. It's not the loneliness of social awkwardness or lack of social skills. It's not the loneliness of depression or anxiety. It's the loneliness of standing on different ground than everyone around you, of seeing what others cannot or will not see, of being unable to participate in the collective dream because you know it's a dream. Jung himself experienced this after his break with Freud. He was professionally isolated, intellectually alone, socially ostracized. The psychoanalytic community viewed him as a heretic. His colleagues thought he'd gone mad. He had no peer group, no one who understood what he was discovering, no validation for the territory he was exploring. He was utterly alone in his consciousness. But here's what he discovered. This loneliness is the birth canal of individual consciousness. You cannot become conscious within the collective. You cannot individuate while remaining comfortable in consensus reality. The collective's rejection isn't punishment for failure. It's the inevitable response to your success at waking up. And this creates a profound moral dilemma. Do you return to sleep for the sake of belonging? Do you suppress your consciousness to regain social acceptance? Do you abandon your authenticity to end your loneliness? This is the choice point every individuating person faces. Jung called it the sacrifice of the natural man, the death of your social self for the birth of your authentic self. And it's called a sacrifice because it costs something real. You lose relationships, you lose status, you lose the comfort of collective belonging. These aren't abstract losses, they're genuine, painful losses. But here's what Jung insisted. The alternative is worse. The alternative is living unconsciously, maintaining the persona, suppressing your authentic self, dying slowly inside while appearing successful outside. The alternative is the loneliness of being surrounded by people who don't see you, of having relationships that aren't real, of living a life that isn't yours. So the question becomes, which loneliness do you choose? The loneliness of isolation from others while being connected to yourself? Or the loneliness of connection with others while being isolated from yourself? Most people choose the second without realizing they're choosing. They sacrifice self-connection for social connection, and then wonder why they feel so empty despite having so many people in their lives. But once you become conscious of the choice, once you see that you're choosing between two forms of loneliness, the calculus changes. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Why terrifying? Because complete self-acceptance means accepting your incompatibility with collective consciousness. It means accepting that you cannot have both authenticity and universal social approval. It means accepting that your awakening will cost you relationships with people who need you to stay asleep. This is why the collective fears your awakening. Not consciously. Most people aren't malicious, but unconsciously, they sense that your consciousness threatens theirs. Your refusal to perform threatens to expose the performative nature of their lives. Your authenticity threatens to reveal their inauthenticity. Your courage to face your shadow threatens to illuminate their shadow that they're desperately avoiding. And so the collective does what it's always done. It marginalizes the conscious few to maintain the unconscious many. It punishes deviation to enforce conformity. It induces loneliness in those who dare to wake up, hoping the pain of isolation will force them back into line. But here's what the collective doesn't understand. For the truly individuating person, the loneliness of awakening is preferable to the loneliness of sleep. Being alone with your true self is less lonely than being surrounded by people who only know your false self. Exile from a collective you can no longer believe in is less painful than remaining imprisoned in that collective. This is the understanding that transforms your loneliness from curse to initiation. You're not lonely because you're broken. You're lonely because you're waking up in a sleeping world. You're not isolated because you're unlovable. You're isolated because you're no longer participating in the collective performance that passes for connection. You're not alone because you failed at life. You're alone because you succeeded at consciousness. And consciousness is lonely until you find others who are also awake. And here's the paradox Jung discovered. The more completely you individuate, the more you paradoxically connect, not with the collective, with other individuated humans, because authentic people recognize each other, conscious people find each other. Those who've done the work of becoming real can finally have real relationships. But you have to go through the exile first. You have to survive the loneliness of waking up before you can find the rare others who are also awake. You have to endure being misunderstood by the sleeping masses before you can be deeply understood by the conscious few. Marcus's story continued. He left the law firm. His marriage ended, not violently, but they'd been married to each other's personas, not each other's authentic selves, and neither was willing to maintain the performance anymore. He moved to a smaller city, took work that paid less but meant more, lived more simply, and in that simpler life, something surprising happened. He began finding his people. Not many, genuine connection is rare, but a few friends who saw him, who got him, who were also navigating the lonely territory of consciousness in an unconscious world. These relationships were different than anything he'd experienced before. There was no performance, no management of impressions, no careful editing of what he revealed, just presence meeting presence. This is what Jung called genuine relationship, connection between authentic selves rather than between personas. And it's only possible after you've survived the loneliness of letting your persona die. It's only possible after you've accepted that the collective will not understand you, will not approve of you, will not validate your consciousness. So understand, the loneliness you're experiencing might not be a personal failure. It might be a collective rejection of your growing consciousness. And if that's true, then ending the loneliness doesn't require you to fix yourself. It requires you to fully become yourself and then find the few others who can recognize and receive that self. But you have to be willing to prioritize truth over belonging. You have to be willing to stand alone rather than betray yourself for company. You have to be willing to accept that consciousness comes at a cost, and that cost is comfort in collective consciousness. Jung said it plainly, one cannot live from anything except what one is. You cannot live from a false self, no matter how socially successful that false self makes you. You can only truly live from your authentic self. And discovering that authentic self requires surviving the loneliness of its emergence. Society fears your awakening because your awakening proves their consensus. Reality is optional. Your consciousness threatens their comfortable unconsciousness. Your authenticity exposes their performance, and they will punish you for it with isolation, not knowing that isolation is exactly what you need to complete your transformation. So let them cast you out. Let them be uncomfortable with your consciousness. Let them exclude you from their unconscious games, because what you're gaining, selfhood, authenticity, genuine consciousness, is worth more than any amount of social approval from people who need you to stay asleep. You were never meant to fit into the collective's dream. You were meant to wake up from it. And the loneliness you feel is not evidence of failure. It's evidence that you're succeeding at the hardest task a human can undertake, becoming conscious in an unconscious world. Welcome to exile. Welcome to awakening. Welcome to the rare company of those who chose truth over comfort. The path is lonely, but it's real. And real, however lonely, is better than false, however crowded. There's a dimension of loneliness Jung identified that most people never name. But once you see it, you'll recognize it instantly. Romantic loneliness, not the ordinary loneliness of being single, something deeper. The aching sense that there's a missing piece, a lost other half, a soulmate who will complete you if only you could find them. This feeling has driven more human behavior than perhaps any other psychological force. And Jung discovered something startling about it. The person you're looking for isn't out there, they're inside you, let me introduce you to two of Jung's most profound and most misunderstood concepts, the anima and the animus. The anima is the feminine aspect within men, not femininity in a stereotypical sense, but the entirety of the unconscious feminine psychology that every man carries. The animus is the masculine aspect within women, the unconscious masculine psychology within every woman. These are not simplistic gender stereotypes. They're complex psychological structures that serve as bridges between consciousness and the unconscious. And here's why this matters for understanding your loneliness. When you feel that aching romantic incompleteness, when you feel like there's someone out there who will finally make you whole, when you experience that desperate hunger for a partner who truly gets you, you're not actually feeling the absence of an external person. You're feeling the presence of an internal figure demanding to be met. Let me tell you about Marcus, not the lawyer from the last chapter, but a different Marcus, a divorced man in his late 30s who came to understand this the hard way. After his divorce, Marcus entered into what he thought was normal dating. He was functional, social, successful, but he had this haunting sense that he was looking for something specific, someone specific. He'd go on dates with interesting women, but none of them felt right. There was always something missing. He kept searching. During a period of forced isolation, a move to a new city for work left him socially disconnected for months. Something shifted. In his loneliness, he started having vivid dreams. In these dreams, a woman kept appearing. Not always the same physical form, but always the same presence. Mysterious, alluring, emotional, creative. She spoke to him in the dreams, challenged him, showed him things about himself he hadn't seen. At first, Marcus thought these dreams meant he was supposed to find this woman in real life, that she was a premonition of his future partner. But as his isolation continued, as he spent more time with these dreams, he began to realize something unsettling. This woman wasn't a preview of someone he'd meet. This woman was him. Or more precisely, this woman was a part of him he'd never acknowledged. His own emotional depth, his own creativity, his own capacity for intuition and feeling that he'd suppressed to be the logical, rational, successful man his father had demanded he become. This was Marcus's anima, and his romantic loneliness, his desperate search for the right woman, had actually been his psyche's way of trying to connect him with his own disowned feminine psychology. Jung discovered this pattern repeatedly in his practice. Men who felt incomplete without a romantic partner weren't actually incomplete without a partner. They were incomplete within themselves. They'd rejected their own emotional depth, their own receptivity, their own capacity for relationship with the unconscious. And that rejection created a void that felt like it could only be filled by finding the right woman. But it couldn't be filled externally. It had to be integrated internally. The same pattern appears in women with the animus. Sarah, the therapist we met earlier, experienced this too. During her isolation, she began recognizing a masculine figure in her dreams and fantasies. A man who was powerful, assertive, intellectual, commanding, everything she wasn't allowing herself to be. She'd been taught that women should be nurturing, accommodating, emotionally available. So her own strength, her own intellectual authority, her own capacity for assertion, these had gone into her unconscious as an animus figure, and her romantic relationships had been disastrous because she kept choosing men who embodied these animus qualities. She'd be attracted to confident, powerful men, then resent them for being confident and powerful. She'd want them to be strong, then feel diminished by their strength. The pattern repeated endlessly because she was trying to find in a partner what she needed to develop in herself. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But he also warned that most romantic relationships aren't actually meetings of two personalities. They're meetings of four, two conscious egos and two unconscious contrasexual figures. You think you're relating to your partner, but you're actually relating to your projection of your anima or animus onto your partner, and they're doing the same to you. This is why relationships often start intensely and then disappoint. In the beginning, you're in love with your projection. You've found someone who seems to perfectly embody your internal anima or animus. They're your soulmate, your perfect match, the one who completes you. But then reality intrudes. The actual person emerges, and they're not your projection. They're a complex, flawed, real human being. And suddenly the magic is gone because the magic was never about them. It was about your relationship with your own unconscious. So here's the radical insight Jung offers. You have to have a relationship with your anima or animus. Before you can have a genuine relationship with an actual person, you have to meet this internal figure, dialogue with it, integrate it, develop it. Otherwise, all your romantic relationships will be attempts to find someone who will do this work for you. And it never works. No external person can integrate your internal figure. This is why loneliness, especially romantic loneliness, is actually an opportunity, not a problem. The loneliness creates the space for you to finally meet your anima or animus. When you're not distracted by actual relationships, when you're not projecting onto actual people, when you're forced into solitude, suddenly these internal figures can emerge. They speak in dreams, they appear in fantasies, they reveal themselves through the qualities you're attracted to in others. And if you can learn to dialogue with them, if you can develop conscious relationship with these figures, something remarkable happens. The desperate need for a romantic partner diminishes, not because you've given up on relationship, but because you've developed the primary relationship that makes all other relationships possible. Relationship with your own depths, your own unconscious, your own psychological wholeness. Jung taught 4 stages of anima-animus development, and understanding these stages helps you see where you are in the process. Stage 1. Projection. This is where most people live. The anima or animus is completely unconscious, completely projected. Men chase women who embody their anima. Women choose men who embody their animus. There's no awareness that these attractions are psychological rather than romantic. People genuinely believe they need to find the right person to be complete. Stage 2. Recognition. Something shifts. Maybe through therapy, maybe through enough failed relationships, maybe through forced solitude. You begin to recognize the pattern. You notice you're attracted to the same type repeatedly. You realize your type says more about your unconscious than about actual compatibility. You start to suspect that what you're seeking isn't out there but in here. Stage 3. Dialogue. This is where it gets active. You begin consciously engaging with your anima or animus. Through active imagination, which we'll explore more deeply in the next chapter, through dream work, through creative expression, you start having actual relationship with this internal figure. Marcus began writing dialogues with his dream woman, asking her questions, letting her respond through his writing. Sarah began painting images of her inner masculine figure, letting him teach her about her own disowned power. Stage 4. Integration. The internal figure stops being external to your consciousness and becomes integrated into who you are. For Marcus, this meant he could access his own emotional depth without needing a woman to give him permission. For Sarah, this meant she could own her own power without needing a man to validate it. The anima or animus doesn't disappear. It becomes a conscious part of your personality rather than an unconscious force controlling you from the shadows. And here's what happens at stage 4 that changes everything. You become capable of genuine relationship. Not relationship based on projection, not relationship based on need, but relationship between two whole people who've already developed relationship with their own depths. This is rare. This is what Jung meant by genuine meeting. Most romantic relationships are two incomplete people trying to steal completion from each other. "You complete me" is one of the most psychologically damaging phrases in modern culture because it literalizes a metaphor that should remain psychological. No person completes you. Your integration of your own anima or animus completes you. And then, from that completeness, you can choose relationship, not because you need it for survival, but because you desire it for deepening. Marcus's story continued in a way that perfectly illustrates this. After spending a year in isolation, doing deep work with his anima, he started dating again. But everything was different. He wasn't looking for someone to complete him anymore. He wasn't projecting his anima onto women and expecting them to be magical. He could see women as actual complex human beings, not as embodiments of his unconscious figures. And paradoxically, his relationships deepened. Women sensed that he wasn't trying to use them to fix something broken in himself. He had his own emotional depth, his own relationship with his interior, his own capacity for intimacy with himself. So intimacy with him was possible in a way it never had been before. This is the gift of romantic loneliness. It forces you to develop relationship with yourself before seeking relationship with others. It forces you to meet your anima or animus in solitude before projecting them onto partners. It forces you to become whole before trying to find wholeness in another. But you have to use the loneliness actively. You can't just wait it out. You have to engage with it, explore it, dialogue with the figures that emerge in it. You have to ask, what qualities am I looking for in a partner? What do those qualities say about what I've disowned in myself? What would it look like to develop those qualities internally rather than seeking them externally? These aren't easy questions. They challenge the entire cultural narrative about romantic love. We're taught that love is finding the right person. Jung says love is becoming the whole person. We're taught that we're incomplete without a partner. Jung says we're incomplete without relationship with our own unconscious. We're taught that loneliness is cured by finding someone. Jung says loneliness is transformed by meeting the someone you've always been looking for, the contra-sexual aspect of your own psyche. This doesn't mean you shouldn't seek romantic relationships. It means you should seek them from wholeness, rather than from need. It means you should engage with them consciously, rather than projecting unconsciously. It means you should choose partners based on who they actually are, rather than on how well they match your internal anima or animus. And you know you've done this work when romantic loneliness transforms, not into fulfillment with a partner that may or may not come, but into a kind of internal marriage, a union of conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine within yourself. Jung called this the conjunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites within the psyche. People who achieve this describe it similarly. They stop feeling desperate for relationship. They stop feeling incomplete alone. They can appreciate partnership when it comes, but they don't need it for survival. They've found within themselves the relationship that everyone seeks, the integration of conscious and unconscious, the balance of masculine and feminine, the wholeness that makes isolation feel less like exile and more like sovereignty. Sarah described it beautifully after her own integration. "I used to think I needed a man to make me complete. Then I realized I needed to become the man I was looking for, not literally, I'm still a woman, but I needed to develop my own strength, my own authority, my own power. And when I did, the desperate need for a partner dissolved. I'm still open to relationship, but I'm no longer incomplete without it. I have the inner marriage that makes outer marriage optional rather than necessary." This is the anima animus work that loneliness makes possible. And it's some of the deepest, most transformative psychological work you can do. Because when you integrate these figures, when you develop conscious relationship with your contrasexual psyche, you don't just heal your romantic loneliness, you gain access to dimensions of yourself that were previously unconscious. Men who integrate the anima gain access to emotional depth, creative expression, intuitive knowing, relational capacity. Women who integrate the animus gain access to intellectual authority, assertive power, logical clarity, individual sovereignty. These aren't stereotypes. They're psychological capacities that get gendered in our culture and therefore suppressed in individuals who don't match the gender coding. And the integration happens in solitude. It happens when you're alone with yourself, long enough to meet the internal other. It happens when romantic loneliness stops driving you toward desperate partnership and starts driving you toward internal integration. It happens when you finally understand that the person you've been looking for isn't out there. They're in here, waiting to be recognized, dialogued with, and integrated. Jung spent years developing relationship with his own anima. He documented it in The Red Book. He gave her a name, Salome, and later, Philemon. He had conversations with her. He let her challenge him, teach him, show him dimensions of himself he'd never accessed. And this work became the foundation of everything he taught about psychology. Your romantic loneliness is your psyche's way of pushing you toward this same work. The ache you feel for connection, for understanding, for someone who sees you. That ache is your anima or animus calling to you, not from outside, but from inside. And if you can turn toward that call instead of away from it, if you can use your solitude to develop this internal relationship, you will discover something most people never find. You don't need another person to be whole. You are already whole once you've integrated the internal other that completes your psyche. This is the loneliness that becomes sovereignty. This is the isolation that becomes integration. This is the romantic hunger that becomes psychological wholeness. And it only happens when you're brave enough to be alone long enough to meet yourself. All of yourself, including the contrasexual other who's been waiting in your unconscious all along. We need to pause here. Before we go any deeper, before you integrate one more concept, before you apply one more of Jung's insights to your loneliness, we need to talk about the ways this knowledge can be weaponized, the ways it can be misused, the ways it can become another tool of ego inflation rather than genuine transformation. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Jung's psychology is powerful, and power can be used for growth or for defense, for liberation or for imprisonment, for genuine transformation or for sophisticated self-deception. And I've seen, and you've probably seen, people who learn Jungian concepts and use them not to become more conscious, but to justify remaining unconscious while appearing enlightened. This chapter is the integrity checkpoint. This is where we examine the three primary ways people misuse this wisdom and why those misuses are more dangerous than simple ignorance, because ignorance is at least honest. But weaponized wisdom, wisdom used to defend against rather than facilitate growth, is a particularly insidious form of resistance to transformation. Misuse number 1, spiritual bypass. This is when you use Jungian concepts to avoid feeling genuine pain rather than to transform it. It sounds like, "My loneliness is just my shadow calling," said while doing nothing to actually meet the shadow. Or, "This is my dark night of the soul," used as an excuse to passively suffer without engaging the process. Or, "I'm individuating," claimed while simply being isolated and calling it growth. There is a moment, perhaps you are living it now, when the noise of the world grows suddenly unbearably quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of rest, but the hollow quiet of absence. The phone stops ringing. The invitations cease. Or perhaps they continue, but you no longer have the energy to pretend they matter. You sit in rooms full of people and feel more alone than you ever did in empty spaces. This is not the loneliness you thought you understood. This is something older, deeper, more insistent. This is the threshold. You have been here before, though you may not remember. Every transformation begins this way, with a door closing behind you and the uncertain darkness ahead. The mystics knew this. The shamans understood. Jung himself walked through this territory and returned with maps drawn in the language of the soul. He called it many things: the night sea journey, the descent into the unconscious, the dissolution of the persona. But beneath all these names lies a simple, terrifying truth. You cannot become who you are meant to be while performing who you think you should be. And loneliness, this aching, hollow loneliness, is the universe removing your audience. For so long you have been watched, judged, measured, and in response, you learned to perform. You learned which version of yourself earned approval, which mask kept others comfortable, which words maintained connection. The persona, Jung called it, that public face we wear, the role we play in the social theater. It is not entirely false. It contains fragments of truth. But it is incomplete, and the incompleteness has been costing you everything. You have been so busy being what others need that you forgot to ask what you need. You have been so skilled at connection that you never noticed how disconnected you were from yourself. The relationships you built on this foundation, however warm, however abundant, could not touch the deepest part of you. How could they? That part was hidden even from you. You showed up as the persona, reliable, appropriate, digestible, and others showed up as their personas in return. You exchanged performances and called it intimacy. You shared space and called it connection. And beneath it all, a loneliness grew. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the more devastating loneliness of being unknown, of never having been truly seen. This is the loneliness that accumulates in a life of false connection. It seeps into the spaces between words. It lingers in conversations that touch everything except what matters. It lives in the exhaustion you feel after social gatherings, the sense that you have been everywhere and nowhere, that you have given everything and offered nothing true. You return home from these encounters more depleted than when you left, and you cannot understand why. You are doing everything right. You are being what you should be, and still, you are unbearably alone. Then something shifts. The external world, through circumstance, loss, change, or simple collapse, withdraws its demands. The connections that once defined you begin to fade. Perhaps someone leaves. Perhaps you are the one who leaves. Perhaps nothing dramatic happens at all. The threads simply loosen, and you realize you no longer have the strength to hold them tight. The persona, which has performed for so long, grows thin and tired. The mask begins to slip, and you lack the energy to adjust it. You find yourself, perhaps for the first time in years, without an audience. And in that absence, the most dangerous question of your life emerges. Who am I when no one is watching? This is the threshold. This is where loneliness stops being a problem to solve and becomes a portal to walk through. But the ego does not know this yet. The ego only knows terror. It was built for survival, for adaptation, for maintaining the known. And the known is crumbling. The ego looks at this threshold and sees death, the death of identity, the death of belonging, the death of everything it worked so hard to construct. It panics. It reaches for distractions, for any connection, for anything that will restore the familiar architecture of self. It would rather maintain a painful connection than face the unknown territory of solitude. But beneath the ego's terror, something else is stirring. The shadow, all the parts of yourself you rejected, hid, or denied to maintain belonging. begins to press forward. These are the aspects you deemed too much or not enough. The anger you swallowed to keep peace. The desire you suppressed to remain appropriate. The grief you performed away to stay strong. The wildness you tamed to be acceptable. The truth you silenced to be loved. You thought you had buried these parts successfully. You thought the persona was enough. But the shadow does not disappear. It accumulates. And now, in this threshold space where the persona's grip is loosening, the shadow demands recognition. This creates an almost unbearable tension. You feel simultaneously too alone and afraid of what you might discover in this aloneness. The external world has withdrawn its distractions, and the internal world is flooding with all you have denied. The ego wants to run back to the familiar, even if the familiar was killing you slowly. The shadow wants to be seen, even if being seen feels like annihilation. And caught between these forces, you stand at the threshold, neither fully in the old life nor yet in the new. This is the fog, the liminal space, the moment before transformation when everything feels like ending and nothing yet feels like beginning. Jung understood this territory intimately. In his early 40s, at the height of his professional success, he experienced a psychological crisis so profound it could have destroyed him. His relationship with Freud collapsed. His theories were rejected by his peers, and more devastatingly, the persona he had built, the successful psychiatrist, the respected scholar, no longer fit. He found himself alone, unmoored, descending into his own unconscious, with no map and no guarantee of return. He experienced visions, heard inner voices, felt himself fragmenting. By any conventional measure, he was having a breakdown. But Jung recognized something his training had not prepared him for. This was not pathology. This was initiation. He descended into the darkness not because he was broken, but because he was breaking open. The loneliness, the isolation, the dissolution of his former identity, these were not signs of failure, but the necessary conditions for transformation. In the depths of that solitude, he encountered the figures of his unconscious, the shadow, the anima, the self. He dialogued with them, painted them, gave them voice. And gradually, through this descent, he discovered the process he would later name individuation, the journey toward wholeness, toward becoming who you actually are beneath who you were taught to be. This is what the threshold offers you. Not comfort, not immediate relief, but something far more profound. The possibility of meeting yourself. The hermit archetype emerges here, not as punishment but as sacred withdrawal. Every wisdom tradition understands this. Transformation requires solitude. The shaman goes alone into the wilderness. The mystic withdraws to the cave. The initiate enters the mystery school's chamber in darkness. These are not exercises in isolation for its own sake. They are recognitions that certain kinds of knowing can only occur in the absence of external mirrors. You must be alone with yourself to discover what is actually yours, what thoughts arise from your depths rather than borrowed from others, what feelings belong to you rather than absorbed from the collective, what desires are genuinely yours rather than implanted by culture. The threshold is teaching you to distinguish between the voice of the ego and the voice of the self. The ego speaks in anxiety, in grasping, in the language of lack. It tells you that this loneliness is evidence of your inadequacy, that your worthlessness has finally been exposed, that you must do something immediately to fix this unbearable state. The ego wants to restore the old connections, re-establish the persona, return to the familiar performance. It experiences this threshold as emergency, but beneath the ego's panic, if you can quiet yourself enough to hear it, another voice speaks. It is quieter, deeper, more patient. Jung called it the self, the true organizing center of your being, the totality of who you are beyond the ego's limited identifications. The self does not speak in panic. It does not demand immediate solutions. It whispers an invitation. Stop performing, stop fleeing, stay here in this uncomfortable space and discover what emerges when you finally stop running from yourself. This is enantiodromia, Jung's term for the principle that everything taken to its extreme transforms into its opposite. Loneliness, when fully entered rather than escaped, becomes the condition for the deepest connection possible, connection with yourself. The isolation that seemed like abandonment reveals itself as protection, the universe creating a sanctuary where you can finally do the work of becoming whole. The silence that felt like emptiness becomes pregnant with presence, your own presence, perhaps, encountered fully for the first time. But you cannot know this yet, standing at the threshold. You can only feel the terrible tension of it, the life you built dissolving behind you, the unknown stretching ahead, and your own deepest self beginning to emerge from the shadows where you banished it long ago. This is the chrysalis moment. You are neither who you were nor yet who you are becoming. You are the in-between, the dissolution, the apparent ending that is actually the beginning. The threshold does not ask you to understand. It does not require faith or spiritual bypassing or positive thinking. It asks only that you stop running, that you cease trying to restore what is crumbling for a reason, that you allow the persona to grow tired, the mask to slip, the performance to finally end. It asks that you sit in the discomfort of not knowing who you are when you are not being who others need you to be. It asks that you make space for the shadow to speak, for the denied parts to emerge, for the wholeness that was always yours to begin reclaiming its territory. This is the precise calibration of transformation. Enough pain to motivate change, enough silence to allow hearing, enough solitude to meet yourself. The universe has not abandoned you to this loneliness. It has not punished you with isolation. It has created the exact conditions necessary for you to stop fragmenting yourself across 1,000 false connections and begin the sacred work of coming home to yourself. The loneliness you fear is not a sign of failure. It is the birth canal of authentic selfhood. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But this becoming requires an unbecorning first, a dissolution of the false, a release of the performed, a death of the persona that has carried you this far but cannot take you any further. And that dissolution, that death, feels like loneliness. It feels like abandonment. It feels like you are losing everything, but you are not losing yourself. For the first time, you are finding yourself. You are standing at the threshold where connection ends and the self begins to whisper. And though you cannot yet hear what it is saying, though you cannot yet know what awaits on the other side, you are exactly where you need to be. This is the fog before the dawn. This is the silence before the word. This is the loneliness that is not absence but presence, the presence of everything you have been waiting your whole life to discover. Stay here. Do not run. The threshold is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of the only story that was ever truly yours to live. At first, nothing changes. You are still alone. The silence still surrounds you. The external world has not rushed back to fill the spaces it vacated, and the loneliness you thought would destroy you continues to be your only companion. But something is different now, though you may not yet have words for it. The panic has quieted, not because the situation has improved, but because you have stopped fighting it. You have stopped reaching backward toward what was, stopped frantically grasping for connection to fill the void. And in that cessation, in that simple, exhausted surrender to what is, the alchemical process begins. The alchemists understood what psychologists would later forget. Transformation cannot be forced. You cannot think your way into wholeness. You cannot perform your way into authenticity. The medieval alchemists, seeking to turn lead into gold, were actually mapping the soul's journey from unconsciousness to consciousness, from fragmentation to integration. They called the first stage nigredo, the blackening, the dissolution, the necessary death. This was your threshold, your loneliness, your dark night. But they knew that nigredo, when fully entered, naturally gives way to albedo, the whitening, the clarification, the emergence of something pure and true that was always present beneath the dross. This is where you are now, in the turning, in the slow, almost imperceptible movement from suffering to sanctuary. The solitude that felt like punishment is revealing itself as protection. The absence of others is creating space for the presence of yourself, and the psyche, that magnificent self-regulating system Jung devoted his life to understanding, is beginning its natural work of restoration and integration. You notice it first in small ways. You wake one morning and realize you did not dream of the person who left, did not rehearse the conversation you wish you had, did not replay the moment everything changed. Your mind, for the first time in weeks or months, was simply quiet. Or you sit with your coffee in the morning silence and feel something other than dread. Not quite peace, not yet, but something softer than the anguish that has been your constant companion. A sense of space, of room to breathe. These are not achievements. You did nothing to earn them. This is the psyche's wisdom, its natural tendency toward equilibrium when the conditions of safety and solitude are provided. Jung called it the transcendent function, the psyche's inherent capacity to create bridges between opposites, to generate new possibilities from seemingly irreconcilable conflicts. You have been at war with yourself, the persona trying to maintain control, the shadow demanding recognition, the ego terrified of dissolution. But in the sanctuary of solitude, these warring parts begin to find each other. They begin, slowly, to speak. The shadow emerges first, because it must. These are the parts you exiled to maintain belonging. The anger you deemed unacceptable. The sadness you performed away. The desire you suppressed to remain appropriate. The truth you silenced to be loved. In the presence of others, these parts felt dangerous. To acknowledge your anger might mean losing connection. To admit your sadness might burden others. To express your true desire might reveal how different you are from who you have pretended to be. So you learned the art of self-abandonment. You learned to betray yourself before others could betray you. But now, alone, the threat has shifted. There is no one here to judge you, no one to abandon you for being too much or not enough. And paradoxically, this is terrifying. The shadow you kept locked away is suddenly free to speak, and you are afraid of what it might say. What if your anger is proof that you are cruel? What if your sadness confirms that you are weak? What if your true desires reveal that you are unworthy of love? These are the ego's fears, the old stories written in childhood and reinforced through years of adaptation. But as you sit with these shadow parts in the solitude that no longer allows you to flee, something unexpected happens. The anger, when finally allowed voice, is not the monster you imagined. It is clarity. It is the part of you that knows your boundaries, that understands when you have been violated, that refuses to accept the unacceptable. Your anger is not evidence of cruelty. It is evidence that you have a self worth protecting. The sadness, when no longer performed away, is not weakness. It is the tender capacity for genuine feeling, the proof that you are alive enough to be touched by life. Your sadness is not pathology. It is the birthright of every conscious being who dares to love in a world where nothing lasts forever. And the desires you suppressed, the dreams you deemed too unrealistic, the longings you thought too selfish, the authentic passions you abandoned to fit into acceptable shapes, these too reveal themselves differently in solitude. They are not shameful. They are the voice of your unlived life, the calling of the self toward its own actualization. Jung understood that the self is not what we achieve in the future. It is what we have always been beneath what we were taught to become. And your authentic desires are the self's language, telling you which direction leads toward wholeness. This is the slow, tender work of shadow integration. Not a dramatic breakthrough, not a moment of enlightenment, but a gradual acquaintance with the parts of yourself you thought were enemies. You begin to see that what you rejected was not actually monstrous, it was simply human. And the exhausting project of keeping these parts hidden, of maintaining the persona's acceptable surface, has been costing you access to your own aliveness, your own truth, your own soul. As the shadow integrates, something shifts in your relationship to solitude itself. It stops feeling like exile and begins to feel like sanctuary. This is not because your circumstances have improved. You are still alone. The phone still does not ring. The invitations still do not come. But you are no longer desperate for them in the same way. You are discovering something the mystics have always known. There is a presence in the silence. There is a companionship in solitude. And that presence, that companionship, is yourself. Not the performed self, not the persona, but the deeper self that has been waiting your entire life for you to stop running long enough to meet it. Jung distinguished carefully between ego and self. The ego is your conscious identity, your sense of I, the part that says, I am this person with this history, these thoughts, these preferences. It is necessary, but it is limited. It cannot see beyond its own perspective. It mistakes its small knowing for the entirety of existence. The self, by contrast, is the totality of your being, conscious and unconscious, personal and transpersonal, everything you are and everything you might become. It is the organizing principle around which your life naturally wants to orient. It is what you are beneath what you think you are. In the sanctuary of solitude, the self becomes accessible in ways it never could, while you were performing for others. The ego, no longer needing to defend or justify or perform, begins to relax its grip. The persona, having lost its audience, no longer demands constant maintenance. And in that softening, in that release, you begin to feel something you may not have felt since childhood, your own presence, not the presence of who you think you should be, but the simple, unadorned presence of who you actually are. This encounter is profoundly intimate. You are meeting yourself, perhaps, for the first time. And the strange truth is that this self is not a stranger. There is recognition, a sense of homecoming. You realize that you have been here before, that beneath all the adaptation and performance and self-abandonment, this essential you has been present all along, waiting patiently for you to remember. The loneliness that drove you to this solitude was not punishment, it was invitation. The universe was calling you home to yourself. The self reveals itself not through grand visions or mystical experiences, though these may come, but through quiet knowing. You begin to understand what is actually yours and what was borrowed. You can distinguish between the anxiety that arises from the ego's protective mechanisms and the peace that emerges from the self's deeper wisdom. You notice which thoughts belong to you and which are the internalized voices of parents, culture, wounded partners, frightened friends. And most crucially, you begin to hear your own authentic voice, the one that has been speaking beneath all the noise but could never be heard while you were so busy being what others needed. This is individuation in its most intimate unfolding, not a dramatic transformation from caterpillar to butterfly, but the slow recognition that you were never the caterpillar at all. That was the persona, the adapted self. You were always the butterfly, waiting for the conditions that would allow you to remember how to fly. And those conditions, paradoxically, were not the presence of others cheering you on, but the absence of others long enough for you to discover that you do not need an audience to be whole. Jung wrote extensively about this paradox. Only those who can be alone can truly be with others. When we seek in relationships what can only be found in ourselves, wholeness, completion, meaning, worth, we create enmeshment rather than intimacy, projection rather than presence, desperate need rather than genuine connection. We ask another person to fill the void that only we can fill for ourselves. And when they inevitably fail, as they must, because no human can be another's missing piece, we feel abandoned, betrayed, confirmed in our unworthiness. But when you have met yourself in solitude, when you have done the work of integration and come to wholeness on your own terms, relationship transforms. You no longer need another person to complete you because you are already complete. You do not seek relationship to escape loneliness, but to share abundance. You do not present a persona and hope it is acceptable. You offer your authentic self and trust that those who are meant to meet you will recognize you. This is the movement from neurotic attachment to authentic relating, from desperation to devotion, from incompleteness seeking completion to wholeness meeting wholeness. The alchemists called this final stage rubedo, the reddening, the return of color and vitality and passion to a life that had gone gray. You have moved through nigredo, the darkness of loneliness and dissolution. You have experienced albedo, the clarification and cleansing of solitude. And now, gradually, you feel life returning to you, not the frantic, performed aliveness of the persona, but something deeper, truer, more rooted, authentic passion, genuine desire, the recovery of your own vitality. You begin to notice what actually brings you alive, not what you think should bring you alive, not what others told you would fulfill you, but what genuinely lights the flame within. You discover or rediscover interests you abandoned, dreams you deferred, callings you ignored because they did not fit the acceptable narrative. And these discoveries are not frivolous. They are the self-expression, the unique shape of your individuation, the particular way your wholeness wants to manifest in the world. This is not selfishness. This is not narcissism. This is the essential work that allows you to eventually return to the world with something genuine to offer. You cannot give what you do not have. You cannot offer authentic connection if you have not connected with yourself. You cannot love others fully if you have not learned to meet yourself with compassion. The solitude that seemed like retreat was actually preparation, the necessary withdrawal that allows return, the descent that makes ascent possible, the death that enables rebirth. You are becoming capable now of what you could not do before: genuine presence. When you meet another person, you are no longer performing for them, seeking their approval, adjusting yourself to fit their expectations. You are simply present, whole, offered. And paradoxically, this is when true intimacy becomes possible. Not the false intimacy of personas meeting, but the real intimacy of two people who have each done the work of becoming themselves, meeting without masks, without pretense, without the desperate need for the other to fill what only they can fill for themselves. The myths all tell this story. Odysseus must journey alone through trials before he can return home. Persephone must descend to the underworld before she can bring spring's renewal. The shaman must face death alone in the wilderness before returning with medicine for the community. These are not stories about isolation for its own sake. They are maps of individuation, reminders that transformation requires withdrawal, that you must go alone into your depths before you can return to offer your depths to others. And now, in this sanctuary of solitude, you understand what those myths were teaching. The loneliness that seemed like a curse was actually a gift, the universe's precise intervention, creating the exact conditions for you to stop abandoning yourself, and begin the journey home. The solitude that terrified you has become the sanctuary where you finally rest, and the self you were seeking in others, the wholeness you thought required another person to provide, you have discovered within yourself, not as an achievement, but as a recognition of what was always, always present. You were never truly alone. You were becoming. And in that becoming, you have discovered that you were always already home to yourself. The loneliness has transformed, not because it disappeared, but because you have transmuted it through the alchemical fire of genuine solitude. What remains is not the ache of absence, but the fullness of presence. Your own presence, met at last, embraced at last, recognized at last as enough. This is the turning. This is how solitude becomes sanctuary. This is how loneliness, fully metabolized, becomes self-discovery. And from this ground, this solid, whole, authentic ground of selfhood, you are finally capable of the genuine connection you always sought, not because you need it to complete you, but because you have something real to offer. The truth of who you are, discovered in the sacred darkness, refined in the purifying silence, and now ready to meet the world without pretense, without performance, without fear. You have walked through the threshold and emerged transformed. The journey is not over. Individuation spirals throughout a lifetime, each cycle deepening the integration. But you have learned the essential truth. You are never alone when you have learned to be with yourself. And that presence, that companionship, that homecoming, this is the gift that loneliness was always trying to give you. You just had to be willing to stop running long enough to receive it. This appears just before your loneliness turns into self-discovery. Carl Jung. There's a moment that comes to all of us, a moment that psychiatry tried to bury, that modern psychology attempted to medicate away, that self-help culture desperately tried to rebrand as something fixable with 5 easy steps. Carl Jung discovered it in the depths of his own psychological breakdown, in the silence of his isolation from his mentor Freud, in the terrifying months when he thought he was losing his mind. He discovered that there is a specific feeling, a particular quality of consciousness that appears in the deepest loneliness, and it is not what you think. It's not despair, it's not depression, though depression often accompanies it. It's not sadness, though sadness flows through it like a dark river. No, what Jung identified was something far stranger, far more electric, far more alive. He called it the psyche's distress signal before transformation. And here's what makes this discovery so unsettling. Your loneliness isn't a problem to solve. It's an initiation ritual your unconscious has designed specifically for you. Think about that for a moment. Every self-help book tells you loneliness is the enemy. Every therapist is trained to help you overcome it. Every social media platform exists to distract you from it. But what if they're all wrong? What if loneliness isn't a bug in the system of human consciousness? What if it's a feature? What if it's the exact mechanism by which your psyche breaks you down so it can rebuild you into who you actually are? I want you to consider something that might sound impossible. There are 2 types of people who experience profound loneliness. The first type spirals deeper and deeper into isolation, becoming bitter, resentful, increasingly disconnected from reality and meaning. They emerge from loneliness, damaged, hardened, diminished. But the second type, and this is what Jung spent decades studying, the second type emerges from the exact same loneliness awakened. They emerge with clarity they never had, with purpose they couldn't have imagined, with a sense of self so solid that external validation becomes almost irrelevant. Same loneliness, completely opposite outcomes. Why? What makes the difference? What invisible psychological mechanics determine whether your loneliness destroys you or initiates you? That's what this script will reveal. Not theory, not speculation. the actual hidden architecture of loneliness's gateway that Jung mapped through his own descent and through decades of work with patients who made this crossing. But first, let me tell you about a feeling you've probably experienced but never had words for. You're in a crowded room, maybe a party, maybe a work conference, maybe even surrounded by family at a holiday gathering. Everyone is talking, laughing, performing the social ritual of connection, and you are utterly devastatingly alone. Not just alone, invisible. You can see them, but they cannot see you, not the real you. They see the mask you're wearing, the persona you've constructed, the version of yourself you present to survive in social space. But the actual you, the one underneath all that performance, that self is locked in solitary confinement even as you smile and nod and say the right things. If you've ever felt this, pause here. Not everyone has. Some people never experience this particular species of loneliness, but if you have, you know exactly what I'm describing. It's the loneliness of being unseen while being looked at. The loneliness of being surrounded by people who know your name, but not your interior life. The loneliness that comes not from lack of company, but from lack of genuine contact. Jung had a name for this. He said, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself, or from holding certain views which others find inadmissible." Read that again. Loneliness doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being unable to share what's actually real for you. It comes from holding a version of reality that doesn't match the consensus, and knowing that if you speak it, you'll be rejected, pathologized, or worse, ignored. This is the loneliness of the psyche in exile. And here's what Jung discovered that changes everything. This exile isn't random. It's not bad luck. It's not a character flaw or a social skills deficit. This exile is purposeful. Your unconscious has engineered it. Because there's something you need to discover about yourself, something you need to integrate, something you need to become, and you cannot do it while you're still performing the social role that keeps you acceptable to the tribe. The loneliness you're experiencing right now, the isolation that feels like punishment, the disconnection that feels like evidence of your unworthiness. It's actually your soul's way of pulling you out of false relationship so you can enter true relationship, first with yourself, then perhaps with others who can actually see you. But you have to understand, this process will break you first. The initiation always begins with a breaking. What breaks is the false self, the persona, the constructed identity you've been maintaining through sheer force of will and constant vigilance. That structure is going to crack. It's already cracking. That's why you're feeling this particular quality of loneliness. Electric, urgent, almost unbearable. It's the sound of your psyche demanding emergence. And here's the forbidden truth that Jung uncovered. You cannot medicate this away. You cannot positive think your way around it. You cannot bypass it with spirituality or distract yourself from it with compulsive productivity or numb it with substance or soothe it with temporary connection. The only way through is through. The only way to transform loneliness into self-discovery is to stop running from it and start listening to what it's trying to tell you. There's a reason they buried this insight. There's a reason modern culture is terrified of solitude, why we're constantly told that being alone is dangerous, that isolation is pathological, that you need to be constantly connected to others to be healthy. Because if people discovered what Jung discovered, that loneliness is the doorway to the self, that isolation is where you meet who you actually are, that the dark night of disconnection is preparation for the dawn of authentic consciousness, then the whole system of control through conformity would collapse. Think about it. What keeps people obedient? What keeps people performing? What keeps people suppressing their truth and molding themselves into acceptable shapes? The fear of being alone, the terror of exile from the tribe, the anxiety that if you stop pretending, stop performing, stop maintaining the mask, you'll be abandoned, cast out, left to die in the wilderness of your own company. But what if that wilderness is actually where you become real? What if that exile is actually where you find your authority? What if the loneliness you're running from is actually the crucible in which your authentic self is forged? Jung discovered this in his own life. After his break with Freud, he entered what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of such intense psychological upheaval that he was unsure whether he would emerge sane. He was professionally isolated. His colleagues thought he'd gone mad. He had no map, no guide, no mentor to tell him he wasn't losing his mind. He was alone with the chaos of his own psyche, with dreams and visions that terrified him, with inner figures that spoke to him in ways that seemed psychotic. But he didn't run. He didn't medicate. He didn't distract. Instead, he did something radical. He listened. He engaged. He dialogued with the chaos. He let the images speak. He recorded everything in what would later become the Red Book, a document so personal, so revealing, so psychologically dangerous that his heirs kept it locked away for decades after his death. And what emerged from that loneliness, from that isolation, from that confrontation with the unconscious? The entire framework of depth psychology that you're learning about right now, the concepts of the shadow, the anima, the self, individuation, all of it came from Jung's willingness to stay in the loneliness instead of fleeing from it. His breakdown became his breakthrough. His isolation became his initiation. His loneliness transmuted into the most creative and generative period of his entire life. This is what's possible for you. Not theory, not metaphor, actual transformation. But you have to understand what you're being initiated into. You have to recognize that the loneliness you're experiencing isn't random suffering, it's meaningful suffering. It has a purpose, it's taking you somewhere. And if you can learn to read its signals, if you can decode what your unconscious is trying to communicate through this isolation, you can emerge from this darkness, not damaged, but awakened. So here's the question you need to ask yourself right now, before we go any deeper. Are you willing to stop treating your loneliness as a problem and start treating it as an initiation? Are you willing to consider that the pain you're in isn't proof of your brokenness, but evidence of your transformation? Are you willing to stay in the fire long enough to see what it's burning away? Because what's about to be revealed in this script is not comfort, it's not reassurance, it's not a path back to the safety of conformity and social acceptability. What's coming is the actual mechanics of transformation, the hidden psychological architecture of how loneliness becomes self-discovery. And once you see it, once you understand it, you cannot unsee it. You cannot go back to the comfortable unconsciousness you had before. Jung warned about this. He said that the journey of individuation, the journey of becoming who you truly are, requires courage. Not physical courage, but the courage to face yourself, the courage to confront what you've been avoiding, the courage to integrate what you've been rejecting, the courage to become conscious even when consciousness is uncomfortable. Your loneliness is the call. The question is, will you answer? Let me tell you about David. On paper, David had achieved everything our culture tells us will make us happy. At 38, he was a senior executive at a Fortune 500 company. He had the corner office, the impressive title, the salary that made his parents proud and his college friends envious. He wore tailored suits, drove a German sedan, lived in a downtown loft with exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows. He attended networking events, closed deals, gave presentations that boards of directors applauded. And on the night of his promotion party, the night his colleagues toasted his success, The night his boss publicly praised his leadership. The night he should have felt triumphant. David stood in the corner of that crowded room, experiencing the most devastating loneliness of his entire life. Not because no one was talking to him. Everyone wanted to talk to him. He was the star of the evening. But as person after person congratulated him, shook his hand, told him they were impressed, he realized something horrifying. Not a single person in that room knew him. They knew the David he performed at work. They knew the David who projected confidence, who made decisive calls, who never showed uncertainty or vulnerability. They knew the mask, but the actual human being underneath that mask, the one who was terrified he was a fraud, who felt hollow inside, who couldn't remember the last time he'd felt genuine joy, that David was completely unknown, invisible, alone in a room full of people celebrating him. This is what Jung called the persona, and understanding the persona is absolutely critical to understanding why you're experiencing the loneliness you're in right now. The persona in Jung's framework is the mask we construct to interface with the social world. It's not fake, it's necessary. Every human being needs a persona to function in society. You cannot show up authentically in every context. You need different presentations for different settings. The persona is how you adapt to social roles. The professional at work, the parent at home, the friend in social settings, the stranger in public. These are all slightly different presentations of self, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. The problem emerges when the persona stops being a tool you use and becomes a prison you inhabit. When you can no longer take the mask off. When the performance becomes so constant, so convincing, so demanded by everyone around you, that you forget there's a real face underneath it. This is what Jung called identification with the persona, when you mistake the mask for your actual identity. And this is exactly what loneliness exposes. Loneliness is the moment when the persona stops working, when the mask cracks, when the performance fails to generate the connection you actually need. Because here's what David discovered that night, what you might be discovering right now. You can be perfectly successful at maintaining your persona and still be completely disconnected from yourself and everyone around you. Jung said, "The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is." This is the key insight. The persona isn't just how you present yourself to others, it's also how you've learned to present yourself to yourself. You've performed the role so long that you've convinced yourself this is who you are. You've received so much validation for the persona that you've abandoned the authentic self underneath it. Think about what you get praised for. Think about what gets you approval, what makes people like you, what earns you respect and recognition. Now ask yourself honestly, is that actually you? Or is that a carefully curated presentation designed to elicit specific responses from others? Are you being yourself, or are you being what works? Most people have been performing for so long they cannot even distinguish between authentic self-expression and strategic self-presentation anymore. The mask has fused to the face. The role has consumed the actor. And then loneliness arrives like a mirror, forcing you to see that everything you've built, your relationships, your reputation, your sense of self, is constructed on a foundation of performance rather than authenticity. This is what Jung called the mask maintenance crisis. It's the exhausting work of constantly monitoring and adjusting your presentation to maintain social approval. You're vigilant about what you say, how you say it, what you reveal, what you conceal. You're always calculating, if I show this part of myself, will they still like me? If I admit this fear, will I lose respect? If I stop being cheerful, will people abandon me? And here's the devastating truth. It works. The mask maintenance works. People do respond to your persona. They do give you validation, affirmation, approval.